I've been a nurse for 5 years, and at the time this happened, I was working at a small hospital in a rural town. It was one of those insane shifts, a 16-hour marathon full of emergencies, difficult patients, and the kind of exhaustion that makes your body feel like lead. It was early December, close to Christmas, so the roads were quiet, and the air had that damp smell of recent rain. I just wanted to get home, take a shower, and collapse into bed. The road I took was a secondary highway, surrounded by forest on both sides and barely any lighting. I remember playing a soft jazz playlist to keep myself awake while driving. The clock on the dashboard showed it was nearly midnight, and the fog was starting to cover the road like a thick, opaque blanket. It all began when I saw a pair of dim red lights in the middle of the road. I hit the brakes and slowed down, trying to make sense of what it was. A car had stopped right in the middle of the road, its hazard lights blinking faintly. From what I could see, it looked like an old sedan with dull paint and a dent on the side. My instinct was to stop and see if someone needed help. Nurses have this automatic habit of caring for others. I pulled over a little ahead of the car, grabbed my phone for the flashlight, and got out. As I approached, I saw a man in the driver's seat. He was sitting still, hands on the wheel, motionless. I tried calling out, "Hey, are you okay? Do you need help?" But he didn't respond. As I got closer, a strange chill ran down my spine, but I brushed it off. It was probably just someone in trouble, right? I knocked on the driver's side window, and that's when he finally moved. Slowly, he turned his face toward me, but didn't roll down the window. His face seemed blank, expressionless, like he was in a trance. He had deep, dark circles under his eyes, and an almost imperceptible smile that was unsettling. I tried to stay calm and asked again if he needed help. He simply pointed with his finger toward the car hood, still saying nothing. "Okay, I'll take a look," I said, trying to sound confident. Something about him felt off, but I thought maybe he was just in shock or as tired as I was. I walked over to the hood, using my phone's flashlight to see if I could spot the problem, but there was nothing obvious. The engine was closed, and aside from the dent on the side, the car looked fine. That's when I heard footsteps, coming from the woods beside the road. At first they were faint, like someone stepping on dry leaves, but then they became heavier and closer. My heart started pounding, and I turned quickly, shining my flashlight into the area. I couldn't see anything but the dense fog and the thick vegetation, but I knew something was there. I stepped back toward the car and looked at the driver again. He was staring at me now, with that same eerie smile, like he knew something I didn't. My mind started racing. Maybe it was just an animal, I thought, trying to convince myself everything was fine. But the footsteps continued, now circling around. I looked back at the driver, hoping for some reaction. Maybe he'd get out of the car to help or say something, but he just stayed there, motionless, with that unsettling smile frozen on his face. "Look, if it's not an emergency, I think you should wait for someone better equipped," I said, trying to wrap this up quickly. Before I could return to my car, I felt a presence behind me. This time, there weren't any footsteps. Just the kind of silence that fills the air with tension, like the moment before a storm. My body froze, and I forced myself to turn around slowly. The flashlight on my phone illuminated something that was hard to process. It was a figure, human-shaped but too tall, too thin, with arms that stretched out like crooked tree branches. The fog made everything look even more surreal, but its eyes were impossible to miss. Bright, like two headlights, fixed directly on me. I was so terrified I could barely breathe. I managed to take 2 steps back before I tripped and almost fell. When I looked again, it had moved closer, almost gliding over the ground without making a sound. That's when I heard the car door open behind me. My instincts screamed at me to run, but my legs felt rooted to the spot. The sound of the car door opening was like a trigger. I turned toward the driver, expecting him to finally say something, maybe explain what was happening. But what I saw made me freeze again. He was out of the car now, standing next to the open door, and something about him was wrong. His movements were too calculated, almost mechanical, and that unnerving smile had twisted into an even more disturbing expression. He began walking toward me, slowly, his footsteps completely silent on the asphalt. My hands were shaking so much I nearly dropped my phone, but somehow I managed to step back without taking my eyes off him. Then I noticed something that sent a fresh wave of panic through me. The figure I had seen in the fog was now standing right behind the driver. They didn't interact at all, but it was clear they were connected somehow. It was as if they shared some unspoken, sinister purpose that I couldn't understand. My only thought was to escape. Without thinking twice, I turned and ran toward my car. My legs felt heavy, like they were moving through quicksand, and the air seemed thicker, making it hard to breathe. I could hear footsteps behind me now, but I didn't dare look back. Every instinct I had told me that looking would be a fatal mistake. I reached my car in what felt like hours, though it had only been seconds. My hands were trembling so much that I struggled to open the door, but I finally managed to get in and lock everything as soon as I sat down. I started the engine automatically, not even checking the mirrors, and floored the accelerator, the tires slipping slightly on the wet road. My heart was pounding so loudly I could barely hear the engine. I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw the two figures standing in the middle of the road, the fog beginning to swallow them up again. The driver still had that fixed smile on his face, and the other figure remained motionless, its glowing eyes piercing through the darkness. As I sped away, I started questioning everything. Maybe I had imagined it all. The exhaustion from the shift could have been playing tricks on my mind, but it all felt too real. The sounds, the faces, the sheer terror. My hands were slick with sweat, and I had to focus hard to keep control of the steering wheel. I decided not to go straight home. The idea of being followed, even by something I couldn't understand, was too much to bear. Instead, I drove to a police station about 15 minutes away, one that I knew would be open 24 hours. When I arrived, I parked and took a deep breath, trying to calm down before stepping out of the car. Inside the station, the place felt eerily quiet, as if time had stopped. There was only one officer sitting behind the desk, distracted by some paperwork. I walked up and explained everything that had happened, trying my best to sound rational. He listened, but the look on his face was one of disbelief, like he thought I was telling some far-fetched story. "You probably just got confused, ma'am. That road gets real foggy. People see things that aren't there all the time," he said, his tone dismissive. I insisted, describing the man, the car, and the figure in detail, but he just shook his head and suggested I go home and rest. Frustrated but somewhat relieved to be in a safe place, I left the station. I decided to take a different route home, even if it meant driving an extra 30 minutes. On the way back, my mind was racing, trying to piece together what had happened. Who was that man? And that figure? Why did they seem connected but so detached from each other? When I finally got home, the adrenaline was still pumping, and I knew I wouldn't be able to sleep. I spent the rest of the night sitting on my couch with all the lights on, trying to convince myself there was some logical explanation. A few days later, I was at a gas station near the start of that road. As I paid, I overheard two truck drivers talking about the car in the fog. I froze, listening intently. One of them said he had seen a car stopped on that same road years ago and had spotted something not human coming out of the woods. The other laughed nervously, dismissing it as superstition, but hearing that short story made my heart race. It wasn't just me. There was something on that road that shouldn't exist, and to this day, I avoid driving there. It was a Friday night, and my girlfriend Emily and I were driving back home after attending a friend's wedding about an hour away from our city. We were both tired, but in good spirits. Emily was laughing at some of the stories the groom shared during his speech, while I tried to keep my eyes on the seemingly endless road in the darkness. The radio played softly, tuned to a local jazz station, and the only light besides the headlights was the lonely moon hanging in the sky. Our routine was simple: work during the week, social events on the weekends. This trip was just another part of our schedule until something unexpected appeared in our path. A few miles before the exit to our city, a detour sign appeared out of nowhere. It was a simple, battered orange sign with an arrow pointing to the right. I didn't recall hearing about any scheduled roadwork, but I trusted it might be a last-minute closure. Emily thought it was strange, but I reassured her it was probably something minor, like a closed bridge or a pothole. When I turned in the direction the sign indicated, the main road quickly gave way to a worn asphalt path, flanked by vacant lots and abandoned warehouses. The silence around us grew so heavy that Emily instinctively turned down the radio. I should have turned back at that moment, but trusting the signs, I kept driving. As we followed the deserted streets, more detour signs appeared, all equally worn and pointing us through a labyrinth of roads I had never seen before. Emily began to fidget. She kept looking out the window, her face tense, her eyes fixed on the darkness outside, muttering that something about this felt wrong. I tried to stay calm, but sweat was already running down my back. The GPS on my phone showed nothing but a blank gray screen. No signal. "We must be close to getting back on the main road," I murmured, trying to sound confident, though my voice wavered. Emily didn't respond, just leaned forward, gripping her seatbelt like she was bracing for something bad. Then, out of nowhere, a pair of headlights appeared in the rearview mirror. At first, I thought it was just another driver who had been rerouted like us, but something about the way the car moved felt off. It wasn't keeping a normal distance. It sped up and got uncomfortably close to our bumper. When I turned down another street, it followed, matching our every move. Emily noticed and whispered, almost panicked, "I think they're following us." My heart raced. I pressed the accelerator, but the narrow, winding road made it hard to gain any real speed. The headlights behind us started flashing intermittently, almost like a warning. There were no houses, no people, no sign of help anywhere. Just us and that car. The tension inside the car was suffocating. Emily was clutching the edge of her seat, glancing back every few seconds, while I gripped the steering wheel tightly. The road seemed to narrow with every turn, flanked by graffiti-covered walls and crumbling warehouses. That's when the car behind us started honking, loud and sharp, the sound echoing through the silence. I didn't know what to do. Should I slow down and try to talk to them? Keep driving and hope they gave up? My gut told me stopping wasn't an option, so I kept going, even though my mind was racing in 100 directions. After a few tense minutes, we reached an intersection, and that's when I realized there were no more detour signs. It was as if they had led us here deliberately. The road ended in a dead end, surrounded by rusted gates and piles of scrap metal. "It's a trap!" Emily shouted, her voice shaking with fear. Before I could react, the car behind us turned off its headlights and stopped in the middle of the street, blocking our way back. Everything went eerily quiet. The only sounds were our heavy breathing and the distant creak of metal swaying in the wind. That's when Emily grabbed my arm and pointed outside. "Someone's getting out of the car!" A man stepped out of the car, and even in the dim moonlight, something about him felt off. He was tall and thin, wearing a long coat that swayed slightly in the wind. His face was hidden by the shadow of his hood, but I could see the glint of something metallic in his hand. Maybe a knife, or worse. Emily was panicking now, whispering through clenched teeth for me to do something. "Reverse! We need to get out of here!" But my hands were shaking so badly on the wheel that I couldn't decide whether to try squeezing past their car or ram the rusty gate in front of us. The man started walking toward us, his steps slow and deliberate, like he knew we had nowhere to go. That's when Emily, in a burst of desperation or courage, began rummaging through the car. She grabbed a flashlight we had left in the glove compartment from a previous trip and switched it on, pointing the beam directly at the man. He stopped abruptly, raising a hand to shield his eyes. For a brief moment, I thought this might give us the advantage we needed. I slammed the accelerator and threw the car into reverse, trying to angle the vehicle toward the left to escape. But then I heard footsteps from the opposite side. It wasn't just him. There was someone else. My heart felt like it was going to explode as I glanced at the side mirror and saw another figure emerge from the shadows. This time, it was a woman. She was shorter but moved quickly with a determined stride. She wore something that looked like an old uniform, which made her presence even more unsettling. Emily's flashlight trembled in her hands as she tried to illuminate both of them at once, but it was no use. The woman was closing in from the right. The man was still advancing from the front, and we were completely surrounded. "We're screwed," I muttered under my breath as Emily desperately searched the glove compartment again, as if she could find something, anything, to save us. Then, in a moment of sheer desperation, I floored the gas pedal and yanked the wheel hard to the side, aiming for a narrow gap between their car and the wall of the dead end. The sound of metal scraping against concrete was deafening, and Emily let out a muffled scream. I didn't know if we'd make it, but I kept my foot on the pedal, feeling the car jolt violently. When we finally broke free of the tight space, I glanced in the rear-view mirror. The man and the woman were standing still, watching us. They didn't run after us, didn't try to stop us. They just stood there, motionless, their silhouettes outlined by the moonlight. Their calmness scared me more than anything else that had happened. After escaping that dead end, I drove aimlessly for a few minutes, trying to find our way back to the main road. Emily was in shock, breathing heavily and muttering almost in a trance. They were waiting for us. They knew we'd come through here. I couldn't disagree. Those detour signs, the desolate location, it all felt meticulously planned. When we finally found a wider road, I slowed down, and Emily managed to use her phone to call the police. As she explained what happened, I realized my hands were so sweaty that I could barely keep a grip on the steering wheel. Every sound, every shadow along the road made my heart race, as if those two could appear at any moment. When we got home, it was nearly 3 a.m. But neither of us could sleep. The police promised to send a patrol to check out the area, but they didn't seem too convinced by our story. "It's probably just vandals or people trying to scare drivers," the dispatcher said before hanging up. That didn't make sense. Who would go to such lengths just to scare someone? All night, Emily sat by the window as if expecting to see those headlights again. I felt useless, unable to protect her from something I didn't even understand. The next morning, I decided to go back to the area alone. Emily begged me not to, but I felt like I needed answers. I needed to see for myself if it was all just a bizarre coincidence or some kind of elaborate prank. I retraced the route, my chest tightening with every turn. In the daylight, the place felt entirely different. The narrow road and abandoned warehouses seemed less threatening, more run down than menacing. When I reached the dead end, I parked and got out of the car. The detour signs were gone. There was no sign of any recent activity. The ground was covered in dry leaves and rusted scraps of metal, as if no one had been there in months. But then I noticed something that froze me in place. A long, deep scratch on the rusty gate at the end of the alley. The exact spot where my car had scraped during our escape. It wasn't my imagination. It really happened. The silence around me felt heavy, almost oppressive, as I searched for any other clues. That's when I noticed the footprints. Not just a few, several sets of them, some small, some large, all leading to the center of the dead end. Like multiple people had been standing there, waiting. As I stared at those footprints, a chill ran down my spine. They looked fresh, the kind of fresh that should have been washed away by the light rain that fell earlier that morning. I tried to shake off the growing dread and decided to leave before anything, or anyone, showed up. As I got back into the car, I felt that uncomfortable sensation of being watched. I glanced in the mirrors, then out the windows, but there was no one there. Still, the feeling lingered, crawling under my skin. On the drive home, Emily called me. Her voice was low, almost a whisper, but filled with urgency. "You need to come back now. There's something here." My stomach dropped. I asked what was going on, but she just repeated that someone had left something at our door and hung up. When I arrived, she was sitting in the living room, pale, holding a small wooden box with a look of fear and confusion. "This was on the doormat. There was no one there." Carefully, I opened the box. Inside was a folded piece of paper and a small metallic object, a rusty old key. The paper had just one sentence written on it: "You were warned." I stood there for a few seconds, holding the paper and trying to process what was happening. Emily was staring at me, waiting for me to say something, but I had no answers. I picked up the key and examined it closely. It was heavy, made of iron, with rust and handcrafted details that looked ancient. None of this made any sense. Warned about what? What did they want from us? Emily suggested throwing the box away and forgetting about it, but I couldn't. Something inside me wouldn't let it go. It felt like I needed to know what the key opened, even though every instinct in me screamed to drop it and walk away. We decided to lock all the doors and windows and try to go about our day as normally as possible, but the tension was unbearable. Emily refused to be alone in any room, and I couldn't stop staring at the box. Then, as night fell, we heard it. A noise outside. It was sharp and repetitive, like someone was throwing pebbles at the living room window. When I peeked through the curtain, my heart nearly stopped. Standing in the middle of the street, under the glow of a street lamp, was the man from the previous night. The same long coat, the same hood. But this time, he wasn't alone. 3 more people stood with him, arranged in a circle, as if deliberately staking out our house. And they were all staring directly at us. Emily panicked. She ran to the bedroom, frantically searching for her phone, but I knew calling the police would be pointless. These people weren't there by accident. They knew where we lived. They knew we were home. "They're not going to stop," Emily whispered when she came back to the living room, her face pale as a sheet. I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to open the door and confront them, but the fear that this was exactly what they wanted kept me frozen. Then, as if they knew we were watching, one of them stepped forward. It was the woman. She raised her hand slowly and pointed directly at the box still sitting on the table. "You think that's it?" I asked Emily, my voice trembling. "You think they want the key back?" She didn't answer, just looked at me as if I held the solution that would save us. Without thinking too much, I grabbed the box and the key, opened the door a crack, and threw them outside. The lid of the box flipped open as it landed, and the key slid to the woman's feet. For a moment, no one moved. Then she bent down, picked up the key, and looked straight at me. Even from a distance, I could feel the intensity of her gaze. Without saying a word, the 4 of them turned and disappeared into the darkness, their footsteps fading away. I slammed the door shut and leaned against it, breathing heavily. Emily rushed over, still shaking. "Do you think it's over?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. I wanted to say yes, that we were safe now, but I couldn't. Something about that final exchange left me uneasy. It wasn't just the woman's stare. It was the silence, the precision of their movements, as if everything had been rehearsed. The rest of the night passed in unbearable tension. Every noise, every shadow outside felt like a new threat. But by morning, the world seemed normal. No sign of the 4 figures, no message, nothing. The following days were quiet, but the fear didn't leave us. Emily insisted that we move, and I agreed. There was no way we could keep living in that house after what happened. But something kept gnawing at me. On the day of the move, as we loaded the last boxes into the truck, I noticed something on the porch. It was a small piece of paper folded neatly. My instincts told me not to touch it, but curiosity got the better of me. I unfolded the note, and once again it contained a single sentence, written in the same hurried handwriting. "It's not over yet." My vision darkened for a moment, and a chill ran down my spine. To this day, I've never seen them again, but I can't shake the feeling that they're just waiting for the right time to come back. Driving a truck was never exactly a dream of mine, but it paid the bills. Back in 2019, I was 36 years old, freshly divorced, and trying to adapt to life on the road. That night, I had just finished a delivery in a small town in Iowa. It was past 2 in the morning, and I was exhausted. I decided to stop at a rest stop I knew well, a simple place with about 4 or 5 truck spaces and a restroom that smelled like pine, but at least it was clean. It was the kind of spot you stop at only because you know there won't be a better option for at least 60 miles. When I parked, I noticed another truck in the far corner, and a black car, an old sedan, slightly dented, parked 2 spots ahead. Nothing too unusual. I turned off the engine, grabbed my flashlight, and stepped out to do my routine walk-around check of the truck before settling in for the night. The beam of my flashlight swept across the tires and the body as I walked, listening to the nighttime sounds. Crickets, the distant hum of engines on the highway, and the wind rustling through the dry trees surrounding the lot. That's when I noticed something strange. The black car was empty. There was no one in the driver's seat or the passenger seat, and the windows were wide open. In the middle of winter, who leaves their car like that? A shiver ran down my spine, but I tried to ignore it. Maybe the driver was in the restroom or walking around. I continued my check, but something about the atmosphere felt off. You know when the air around you feels heavy, like someone's watching you? Yeah, that's exactly how it felt. When I finished checking the driver's side, I heard a faint sound from the back of the truck. It was muffled, like footsteps dragging on the pavement. My heart skipped a beat, but I told myself it was just my imagination. Even so, my flashlight shook slightly in my hand as I moved toward the sound. When I got there, I looked around but saw nothing. Just the dark parking lot, the shadows cast by the dim streetlights, and the black car still motionless, like it didn't belong there. But then, as I turned to head back to the cab, I swear I saw something move in the shadows near my rear bumper. My body froze. I tried to focus the flashlight, but whatever it was disappeared as quickly as it had appeared. I decided to get into the cab and lock the doors, but the feeling of being watched wouldn't go away. Before climbing up, I took one last look around, trying to figure out what was bothering me so much. That's when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Fresh footprints on the pavement near the back of the truck, leading toward the passenger side. They were small, like those of someone barefoot. It was the kind of detail that made adrenaline surge through me. My gut told me to get in the truck and drive away, but at the same time, I felt the need to make sure no one was hiding there. Maybe it was an animal, a lost kid, or just my mind playing tricks on me. I grabbed a tire iron from the tool compartment and walked cautiously to the passenger side, my heart pounding in my chest. My flashlight scanned the ground as I approached, and that's when I noticed something even stranger. The footprints stopped right next to the truck, but there was no sign of anyone. No movement. No sound. The tire iron was clenched tightly in my hand, and the silence around me felt deafening. All I could hear was the wind and the faint hum of the nearest streetlight. I took a few steps around the truck, trying to gather the courage to look underneath, but there was something deeply wrong with the silence. It was like the whole world had stopped breathing. I took a deep breath, crouched down, and shone the light under the truck. Nothing. Absolutely nothing. But the sensation of being watched only grew stronger. When I stood back up, it was as if the air around me had become thicker, almost suffocating. I turned quickly, half expecting to find someone standing there, but the lot was empty. Just me, my truck, and the black car. That's when I noticed something that froze me in place. The passenger door of my truck was slightly open. I was certain I had locked all the doors before stepping out. I ran to the cab, shining my flashlight around, and pushed the door fully open. The cab looked empty at first glance, but something was off. My hat, which I always kept hanging on the back of the seat, was now on the floor. My backpack had been turned over, the zippers open, like someone had gone through it. At that moment, the idea of being alone wasn't an option anymore. My breathing was heavy as I inspected the cab with the flashlight. There was no sign of anyone, but every corner felt like it was hiding something invisible, something ready to jump out at any moment. "It's fine, calm down, there's no one here," I whispered to myself, trying to keep it together. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. I climbed into the truck and locked the doors again, this time pressing them hard as if that could protect me. I started the engine and left the headlights on, illuminating the empty parking lot. I was about to shift into gear and leave when movement caught my eye. In the side mirror, I saw something moving toward the black car. It was a low, crouched figure, but before I could focus properly, it disappeared into the shadows. I knew I should leave, but curiosity was eating away at me. It was like something was calling me to understand what was happening. I pulled out my phone and quickly snapped a photo of the black car, zooming in to get a better look. Nothing was visible at first, but in the reflection of the back window, something seemed wrong. There was a shape, a shadow that shouldn't have been there, as if someone was inside the car, turned away from the seat. My stomach twisted into a knot, and my hands were so sweaty that I nearly dropped my phone. I decided I'd seen enough. It was time to leave before things got any worse. I turned on the high beams and began maneuvering to leave the lot, but as I did, a sudden urgency stopped me. Something was preventing me from just driving away. As I maneuvered, I heard a sharp sound from the back of the truck. It was a dry thud, like someone had hit the metal. I slammed the brakes immediately and looked in the mirrors, but I didn't see anything. The engine idled low, and the cab felt tighter than ever. The sound came again, louder this time, followed by what sounded like long scratches. I rolled the window down just enough to hear better, and that's when a strange noise reached my ears. A low, irregular laugh, almost childlike, but completely devoid of emotion, as if someone was imitating a child. The sound was coming from the back of the truck, near the rear bumper. I was terrified, but something inside me insisted I needed to see what it was. I grabbed the tire iron again and stepped out, my legs trembling so much I could barely plant my feet on the ground. My focus was on the back of the truck, but as I started walking in that direction, something caught my eye at the black car. The windows were still open, but now something was hanging from the driver's side door. It looked like a rag or a bag, but when I shone the flashlight on it, I realized it was something far worse. It was an old, dirty jacket. But what truly froze my blood was the fact that I recognized that jacket. It was the same one I'd left in my truck cab minutes earlier. My heart felt like it was going to explode out of my chest. How had that jacket gotten there? My mind raced, trying to come up with logical explanations, but none of them made sense. Had someone broken into the truck while I was distracted? But how, when I had locked everything? I took a step toward the black car, my flashlight shaking in my hand. That's when I heard a muffled sound coming from inside the car, like heavy breathing or a low sigh. The feeling of being watched returned in full force, like the darkness itself had eyes. Despite the rising panic, I couldn't help myself. I moved closer, shining the light into the car's interior, but what I saw inside was worse than anything I could have imagined. In the back seat, there was a figure crouched down. I couldn't make out its face because it was turned away, knees drawn to its chest, arms wrapped around its legs, like someone trying to hide or protect themselves. The figure was completely still, but its presence felt fundamentally wrong. I tried to speak, my voice trembling. "Hey, are you okay?" "Do you need help?" No response. Just the sound of my own breathing echoing in the silence. The thing didn't move, didn't react. But something about its presence triggered an instinctive, almost primal fear. It was like my body knew what my mind hadn't yet processed. This wasn't human. My mind screamed at me to run, but my legs felt glued to the ground. The beam of my flashlight flickered, illuminating the figure for seconds that felt like an eternity. That's when something absolutely terrifying happened. The figure began to move. Not in a natural way, but as if every joint was dislocated, bending at impossible angles. It turned slowly, and at that moment, my blood ran cold. There was no face. Where its eyes, nose, and mouth should have been, there was only a smooth, pale surface, cold like wax. Even without eyes, I knew it was staring straight at me, boring into my soul. I didn't think twice. I took a step back, nearly tripping, and ran for the truck. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it would burst. I climbed into the cab, locked the doors again, and started the engine with shaking hands. The headlights illuminated the black car, but now the figure was gone. I scanned the lot in every direction, but it was empty again, as if nothing had happened. Then I felt something I will never forget. A presence behind me, inside the cab. It was as if the air had changed, turning cold and heavy. I froze, too afraid to check the rearview mirror. But for some reason, I turned slowly. And there it was, sitting in the passenger seat, completely still, with that featureless face turned toward me. I almost passed out from pure terror. The air in the cab felt sucked out, and every fiber of my being screamed to get out. Without thinking, I floored the gas pedal. The truck lurched forward with a jolt, tires screeching on the asphalt. But I had no idea where I was going. I just wanted to get away. My eyes stayed glued to the road ahead, trying to ignore the motionless presence in the passenger seat. But I couldn't ignore it for long. The cab was freezing, and the silence was so thick I could hear my own ragged breathing. Finally, I glanced to the side. The seat was empty. The relief was immediate, but it lasted only a second. A horrible sound, like nails scraping metal, came from the back of the cab. I looked in the rearview mirror, and my heart stopped. The figure was there, outside the cab, clinging to the back of the truck. Its movements were impossible, as if it were climbing against the wind at 60 mph, its body contorting unnaturally. The road ahead seemed endless, and I had no idea what to do. I tried speeding up, but it stayed there, inching closer and closer. The sound of the scratching was deafening, and the only thought in my head was, "I'm not getting out of this alive." In a panic, I started honking the horn frantically, hoping to attract attention, hoping someone on the road would see what was happening. But the highway was deserted, just me and that thing clinging to my truck. My hands were shaking so much I nearly lost control of the wheel. The sound of the scratching grew louder, and then I remembered the most obvious tool at my disposal: the brakes. I slammed the pedal hard, and the truck jerked violently, tires screeching against the pavement. I heard a loud thud from the back, like something had hit the metal hard. I took a deep breath and checked the rearview mirror, praying that whatever it was had fallen off. But what I saw nearly made me lose control again. The figure was standing in the middle of the road, completely still, staring at me. Even without a face, it was like I could feel its rage, a hatred that seemed to poison the air around it. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I released the brakes and floored the gas, leaving it behind. My headlights illuminated its silhouette for a few seconds before it vanished into the darkness. My mind was in chaos, but one thing was clear. I needed to get off that road as soon as possible. I drove for over an hour without stopping, ignoring the exhaustion and the terror that pulsed through every muscle in my body. The road seemed endless, but finally I saw the lights of a gas station. It wasn't much different from the rest stop where it all started, but it felt like an oasis in the desert. I parked the truck haphazardly and jumped out, still clutching the tire iron like it was a weapon. I looked around, searching for any signs of what had chased me. Nothing. Just the sound of the truck's engine and the fluorescent lights of the station. I entered the small convenience store, where the clerk, a thin man with glasses, who looked like he'd seen it all, gave me a curious look. "You okay, man?" he asked, noticing my state. I tried to explain what had happened, but the words came out jumbled, like my mind was still trapped in the terror of that night. He listened silently, but his expression changed when I mentioned the black car. "You're not the first to say something like this," he said, lowering his voice. "I've heard stories from other truckers seeing weird stuff on this stretch of highway. Nobody knows what it is, but the best thing you can do is keep moving and never stop here again." I left the gas station soon after, not daring to look back. To this day, I don't know what really happened that night. What was that thing? How did it get into my truck? All I know is that I've never driven down that highway again. Sometimes I still dream of the black car parked in the darkness, its windows wide open. And in all those dreams I feel like I'm being watched, even when I can't see anyone. I'm a high school literature teacher in a small town. This happened about 4 years ago, on a Friday night when I stayed late grading papers. I remember being exhausted, just wanting to get home, take a hot shower, and sleep. My routine was simple: work, home, and occasionally dinner with friends. I lived alone in a rented house on the outskirts of town, so the drive back was always long and quiet, especially at night. The last stretch of the route was on a deserted road surrounded by trees and dark fields, and that night, the silence felt heavier than usual. I was halfway down that lonely road when I saw the high beams in my rearview mirror for the first time. At first, I didn't think much of it, assuming it was just an impatient driver wanting me to go faster. But I was already doing about 50 km/h, a little over the speed limit. I kept driving, trying to ignore it, but the lights kept flashing, more insistent each time. That creeping feeling of unease started to build in my chest. Something didn't feel right. The road was completely empty, no other cars in sight, and I began to wonder why someone would be so desperate to get my attention in such an isolated place. I decided to slow down a bit to see if the car would pass me, but instead, it slowed down with me. That only made everything feel more unsettling. The driver kept flashing their high beams in a chaotic, almost frantic pattern, as if they were trying to tell me something urgent. I tried to convince myself it was a teenager messing around or maybe someone needing help, but a darker part of me started imagining something worse. Stories of highway robberies and ambushes in remote areas flashed through my mind, and the thought of stopping made me feel sick. My hands were sweating on the steering wheel, and my heart was pounding so loudly I could barely think. As the high beams flashed again, they lit up the inside of my car through the rearview mirror. For a split second, I thought I saw movement in the back seat. I glanced quickly at the mirror, trying to stay casual, but I didn't see anything. My mind started racing with absurd scenarios, but it was late, and I was tired. It could have been nothing. Still, I locked my car doors and kept driving, my attention darting between the road ahead and the mirror behind me. The car behind me didn't let up, and the fear in my chest turned into a cold, sinking dread. I had to decide what to do. A few minutes later, I saw a small pull-off area up ahead, dimly lit by one of those weak yellow streetlights. I decided I'd stop there. If this was someone trying to scare me or a crazy driver, at least I'd be in a semi-lit area to handle the situation. As I pulled over, the car behind me slammed to a stop, blocking any chance of escape. I watched through the mirror, trying to see who would get out, but the dim light didn't help much. All I could make out was the silhouette of someone tall, moving quickly toward my car. My heart felt like it was going to explode. I grabbed my phone from the passenger seat, ready to call 911. but my hands were shaking so badly I nearly dropped it. Then the man started banging on my window frantically, pointing at my car and motioning for me to get out. I rolled the window down just a crack, enough to hear what he was saying. "There's someone in your back seat," he shouted, his voice raw and trembling. His words froze me in place. My entire body locked up, and the thought of turning around to look felt impossible. My eyes darted to the rearview mirror, and what I saw almost made me faint. A shadow. A distorted figure hunched down as if it was hiding right behind my seat. My body moved before my mind could catch up. I threw open the door and practically stumbled out onto the asphalt. The man, still beside my car, grabbed my arm and pulled me behind him as if to shield me. For a second I thought this was all some kind of trap, but the look on his face was pure terror. "Run!" he yelled, his voice breaking, while pointing toward my car. I didn't stop to think or question. My legs took off, and I sprinted toward the pull-off area, where there was an old, abandoned phone booth. When I turned back to look at the car, the passenger door was wide open, swinging slightly in the wind. The man stood frozen, staring into the vehicle but not getting any closer. I screamed at him to get away, but he seemed paralyzed. Then something happened that I'll never forget. A figure emerged from the car. It wasn't human. It was tall, with elongated limbs and movements that were somewhere between a glide and a stumble. It stood under the weak yellow light for just a moment before disappearing into the darkness of the road, swallowed by the night. My entire body was trembling, and it felt like the air had been sucked out of my lungs. After the figure vanished, the man finally ran toward me. He was out of breath, his face pale and his eyes wide with fear. "Did you see that?" he asked, as if he needed confirmation to believe what had just happened. All I could do was nod. My body was still frozen, and my hands were trembling so much that I could barely hold my phone. He insisted we call the police, but the idea of explaining this to anyone felt ridiculous. Who would believe something like that? Still, I dialed with shaking fingers while he kept his eyes glued to the road, as if expecting the thing to come back. The police arrived in less than 20 minutes, though it felt like hours. I couldn't bring myself to get back in my car, so I sat on the edge of the road, hugging my knees, while the man tried to explain the situation to the officers. They inspected the car with flashlights but found nothing. No signs of anyone being inside or anything unusual. One of the officers looked at me with that skeptical expression, the kind they reserve for people they think are paranoid or making things up. "Are you sure you saw someone?" he asked, with the tone of someone who already doubted my answer. But I knew what I saw, and so did the man. After the police left, I couldn't imagine driving home alone. The man, who introduced himself as John, offered to drive me home. I hesitated for a moment. After all, just minutes earlier, he had been the scary guy flashing his high beams at me. But the idea of driving alone on that road was unbearable. I agreed, and he insisted on following my car closely to make sure I got home safely. It was the only way I could muster the courage to get back behind the wheel. The drive home was a blur, and my mind kept replaying the image of that distorted figure. When I finally got home, John waited until I was safely inside before leaving. I locked every door and window and spent the rest of the night sitting on the couch with all the lights on. The fear was so overwhelming that it felt like something was still out there, watching me. In the days that followed, I avoided driving at night and started seeing a therapist to cope with what had happened. To this day, I don't know what that thing was. Maybe it was an intruder, something supernatural, or even a manifestation of my own exhaustion and paranoia. But what haunts me most is that John saw it too, because if he saw it, then it wasn't just in my head.
Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel. And leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. The morning I found our prize stallion dead in his stall was when I finally understood we weren't dealing with ordinary neighbors anymore. I'm writing this from my sister's apartment in Chicago. 3 states away from the farm my wife Grace and I poured everything into for 6 years. We moved to rural Montana in 2018, chasing that American dream of sustainable living and organic farming on 40 acres of beautiful grassland bordered by cottonwood trees. Grace had inherited some money from her grandmother, and I'd been saving since college, working construction and living cheap. We bought the property from an elderly couple, the Millers, who'd been there 40 years and couldn't manage the work anymore. They warned us about the Crawfords next door, said they were particular people, but we figured every rural area had its quirky locals. God, if only we'd listened closer to what they weren't saying directly. The Crawfords owned about 300 acres surrounding our property on 3 sides. Earl, his 2 adult sons Tommy and Wade, and Tommy's wife Suzanne. Earl must have been pushing 70, with these pale gray eyes that never seemed to blink when he stared at you, and arms like tree trunks despite his age. The sons were carbon copies of their father, just younger and meaner looking, especially Wade, who had this scar running from his left ear down to his jaw that pulled his mouth into a permanent sneer. The first time we met them, they came over unannounced while we were still unpacking, stood at our fence line just watching us for maybe 20 minutes before Earl finally called out. They wanted to buy our land, offered us exactly what we'd paid for it, said it used to be part of their family's original homestead back in the 1920s. When we politely declined, explaining we'd just arrived and planned to start our organic vegetable operation, Earl just nodded real slow, spit tobacco juice on our grass and said, "We'll see how that works out for you." At first, everything seemed fine. We started our vegetable gardens, bought some chickens and goats and that beautiful Arabian stallion I mentioned. His name was Mercury, and Grace loved that horse more than anything. The problems started small, almost like accidents. A gate left open here, letting our chickens wander into the road where 3 got hit by a truck. Our new rototiller disappeared from the barn one night, then showed up 2 weeks later in our pond, completely ruined. Grace's greenhouse had a brick thrown through it during a windstorm on a night with no wind. Each time something happened, we'd see the Crawfords the next day, and they'd ask how things were going with these little smirks on their faces. Earl would always mention how farming was tough work, how lots of city folks couldn't hack it, how that land had been in their family for generations before the Depression forced them to sell that section. Wade started driving his pickup along our shared fence line every morning at 5 a.m., laying on the horn for a good 30 seconds, claimed he was checking his cattle, though there weren't any cattle in that pasture. The escalation happened on a Saturday in early September. I was in town getting feed when Grace called me, barely able to speak through her tears. She'd gone to check on Mercury and found him thrashing in his stall, foam coming from his mouth, his eyes rolled back, showing pure white. By the time I got home, our vet Dr. Paulson was already there, but it was too late. Mercury was gone. The vet found traces of antifreeze in his water bucket. Someone had poisoned him deliberately. We called the sheriff's office immediately, and Deputy Coleman came out, took pictures, asked questions, wrote everything down carefully in his little notebook. Then he got this uncomfortable look on his face and explained that without direct evidence linking anyone to the crime, there wasn't much they could do. When I pointed out that the Crawfords were our only neighbors for miles, Coleman just shrugged and said, Earl Crawford's cousin was the sheriff, had been for 12 years, and maybe we should consider installing security cameras if we were worried about our property. That night, we barely slept. Grace kept crying about Mercury, and I sat by the window with my grandfather's old shotgun across my lap, watching the darkness outside. Around 3 a.m., I saw headlights moving slowly along our driveway, stopping just before the motion sensor lights would trigger. The vehicle sat there for maybe 10 minutes, engine running before backing out and disappearing. The next morning, We found every single one of our vegetable rows had been sprayed with herbicide. 6 months of work destroyed overnight. The chemical smell was so strong it made your eyes water from 50 feet away. But the worst part was the message they'd spelled out in dead grass on our front lawn. Last chance. Each letter was probably 10 feet tall, burned into the earth with whatever poison they'd used. Grace wanted to leave right then, pack what we could fit in the truck and never look back. But I was angry, furious really, and made the stupid decision to confront them directly. I drove over to the Crawford place that afternoon, my shotgun visible in the truck's rear window, not to threaten, just to show I wasn't some pushover they could intimidate. Their property looked like something from a horror movie, honestly, with rusted equipment scattered everywhere, old cars on blocks, and these massive dogs on chains that went absolutely berserk when I pulled up. Earl came out first, then Tommy and Wade emerged from the barn, and Suzanne watched from the porch with this blank expression like she was watching television. I stayed in my truck, window down, and told Earl I knew what they'd done, that we had photos of everything, and if anything else happened, I'd make sure every newspaper and news station in the state heard about it. Earl walked up to my window real slow, leaned in close enough that I could smell the chewing tobacco and something else, something rotten on his breath. He said very quietly, "Boy, you don't know what you're playing with here. This land has been ours since before your grandfather was born." The Millers understood that. They stayed quiet, stayed small, and we let them play farmer for 40 years. But you come here with your organic this and sustainable that, putting up fancy signs, talking to folks in town about expanding, about buying the Jacobson plot that borders our south field. That ends now. Wade stepped closer to the truck then, carrying something in his hand I couldn't quite see at first. When he got close enough, I realized it was a cattle prod, the kind they use on livestock, and he was tapping it against his leg in this rhythmic pattern. Tommy circled around to the passenger side, and I noticed he had a pistol tucked into his waistband, not hidden, just there for me to see. "Here's what's going to happen," Earl continued, his voice still that quiet, controlled tone that was somehow worse than yelling. "You're going to go home, pack up your pretty wife, and be gone by Sunday. We'll buy your place for half what you paid. Call it a convenience fee for all the trouble you've caused. Or you can stay and find out what happens to people who don't respect the natural order of things out here. The Jacobsons thought they were tough too, back in 2016. Haven't seen them around lately, have you?" The way he said it made my chest tighten. I'd heard the Jacobsons had left suddenly in the middle of the night, left everything behind, never even listed their property for sale. It had gone to bank auction eventually. I drove home with Wade's pickup following me the entire way, riding so close I could see his grinning face in my rearview mirror. When I told Grace about the conversation, she broke down completely. That night, we moved our mattress into the walk-in closet of our bedroom, no windows there, and took turns staying awake. Around midnight, our motion sensor lights started going off one by one, starting from the barn and moving toward the house in a pattern that couldn't be animals or wind. Then we heard the barn doors slam open, heard our goats screaming. Not their normal sounds, but these high-pitched shrieks of terror. I grabbed the shotgun and headed for the door, but Grace held me back, begging me not to go out there. We called 911, but the dispatcher said all units were responding to a major accident on Highway 287. Would be at least 2 hours before anyone could come. We sat there in that closet, listening to our animals in distress, to footsteps on our porch, to someone trying our doorknobs one by one. At one point, whoever it was started whistling Amazing Grace right outside our bedroom window, and Grace had to cover her mouth to keep from screaming. When dawn finally came, we ventured outside to find carnage. 3 of our goats had been killed, their bodies arranged in a line by the barn door. Our chicken coop was demolished, feathers and blood everywhere. Though strangely, most of the chickens were just gone, not dead, just missing. They'd spray-painted Sunday on the side of our barn in red paint that looked disturbingly like blood in the morning light. Our truck had 4 flat tires. Every window on the greenhouse was systematically broken, and they'd dumped what must have been 50 gallons of motor oil into our well. The final touch was a dead coyote hung from our front gate, with a note pinned to it that read, "You're next." We took photos of everything, called the sheriff's office again, and this time Sheriff Crawford himself showed up. Earl's cousin, looking like an older, fatter version of the family. He walked around, nodded at the damage, and then told us with a straight face that it looked like we'd had some bad luck with wild animals, maybe a pack of coyotes or wild dogs. When I showed him the spray paint, the note, he suggested maybe we did it ourselves for insurance money. Said he'd need to investigate us for fraud if we pursued this any further. We left that afternoon, packed what we could fit in Grace's sedan, the truck was useless, and drove away from everything we'd built. As we passed the Crawford farm, all four of them were standing at their fence line, watching. Earl gave us a little wave, real friendly-like, and Wade fired his rifle into the air just once. A farewell message we understood perfectly. We stayed with Grace's sister for a week, trying to figure out what to do, contacted lawyers who all said the same thing. Without evidence and with local law enforcement against us, we had no case. Then we got a call from a neighbor we'd barely known, Mrs. Garrett, who lived about 5 miles down the road. She whispered into the phone like she was afraid someone might hear. Told us the Crawfords were living in our house now, had moved their stuff in the day after we left. Said everyone in town knew what they did to folks who bought that property, had been doing it for decades, but nobody dared speak up because Earl's family had connections everywhere. The sheriff, the bank president, even the district judge was married to Earl's niece. The bank foreclosed on our property 2 months later. We couldn't make the mortgage payments without being able to work the land or sell our harvests, and mysteriously, all our insurance claims were denied or tied up in investigations. Grace found out through a friend that the Crawfords bought our 40 acres at auction for a quarter of what we'd paid. Cash payment, no questions asked. The auctioneer was Earl's brother-in-law. We tried reaching out to the FBI, to state police, to anyone who might listen. But rural property disputes weren't exactly high priority, and without concrete evidence linking the Crawfords to specific crimes, we were just another couple with a sob story about bad neighbors. The worst part was learning we weren't the first. Mrs. Garrett eventually sent us newspaper clippings going back to the 1990s. Little mentions of families who'd bought that same property and left suddenly, some saying they'd been harassed, others just disappearing without explanation. The Millers, the couple who'd sold to us, finally returned our calls after months of silence. They were living in Florida now, and Mr. Miller's voice shook when he told me they'd tried to warn us subtly, but Earl had made it clear what would happen to them if they said too much to potential buyers. We're still in Chicago now, living in a 2-bedroom apartment where the only green space is a small balcony where Grace grows herbs in pots. She doesn't talk about what happened much, but sometimes I catch her looking at photos of Mercury on her phone, and she'll close it quickly, pretending she was checking the weather. We both have regular jobs now. I'm back in construction, she's working at a dental office. And we tell people we used to live in Montana but don't elaborate. Sometimes I'll wake up at 3 a.m. thinking I hear that whistling outside our window, even though we're on the 8th floor. Last month I got a package with no return address. Inside was a photo of our old farm, the gardens all plowed under, cattle grazing where our vegetables used to grow, and the Crawfords standing in front of our house, their house now, all 4 of them smiling at the camera. On the back, someone had written, "Thanks for the improvements." I burned it in the sink, but Grace saw the ashes and knew. She applied for a job in Seattle the next day, and we're moving again next month. Sometimes the only way to win is to run far enough that they can't follow, and hope the next place doesn't have its own Crawfords waiting. People always ask me why I left Nebraska after 15 years of working the same farm. The truth is, after what happened that night in October 2022, I couldn't stand being alone in those fields anymore. I was 34, divorced, no kids, and I'd been managing the Brennan family's cattle operation since I got out of the Army. It was honest work, feeding the livestock, checking fences, making sure the water systems kept running through those brutal winters. The property sat on about 800 acres outside a town you've probably never heard of. Population barely pushing 2,000. Most nights, the only sounds were the cattle shifting in their pens, and maybe a coyote howling somewhere in the distance. I lived in a small house on the property. Nothing fancy, just a 2-bedroom place with a kitchen that leaked when it rained hard, and a porch where I'd sit with my coffee every morning, watching the sun come up over the cornfields. The neighboring farm belonged to the Novak family, and their daughter Cassie had been spiraling for about 3 years by then. She was maybe 28, used to be pretty before the meth got its hooks in her, had this long auburn hair she'd cut off with kitchen scissors one night, leaving these jagged chunks that stuck out at weird angles. Her dad, Frank, was a quiet guy who raised soybeans and kept to himself after his wife died of cancer. Cassie would show up at my place maybe twice a month, always with some story about needing gas money or her phone being shut off. She'd pick at these sores on her arms while she talked, her eyes darting around like she was watching for something nobody else could see. I usually gave her $20 just to get her to leave because arguing with her was pointless. She'd just come back the next night, knocking louder, sometimes throwing gravel at my bedroom window until I came outside. That particular Sunday started normal enough. I'd spent the morning fixing a section of fence the bulls had knocked down, then drove into town for groceries around noon. The cashier at the Save-A-Lot, Beverly, mentioned she'd seen Cassie at the gas station earlier, arguing with the manager about something. Beverly had this way of lowering her voice when she gossiped, leaning across the register like we were sharing state secrets. She said Cassie looked worse than usual, wearing this oversized green jacket even though it was almost 70 degrees out, and she kept pacing in circles by the pump, talking to herself. I just nodded and loaded my groceries, figured it was none of my business. By the time I got back to the farm, the sun was already starting to dip low, painting everything this burnt orange color that made the fields look like they were on fire. I remember thinking it was too quiet. Usually Frank's dogs would be barking by then, these 2 German shepherds he kept that would lose their minds every time a car drove past. I was in the barn around 8 that night, treating a calf with an infected hoof, when I heard footsteps on the gravel outside. Not normal walking, more like someone stumbling, catching themselves, stumbling again. The barn door scraped open, and there was Cassie, but something was different this time. Her pupils were so dilated her eyes looked completely black, and she had this sheen of sweat across her forehead, even though the temperature had dropped to maybe 50 degrees. She was wearing that same green jacket Beverly mentioned, but now I could see these dark stains on the sleeves that looked almost brown in the barn's fluorescent lights. Her hands kept clenching and unclenching, and when she opened her mouth to speak, I noticed her bottom lip was split, blood dried in the corner. "I need your truck," she said, not asked, said like it was already decided. "And I need $300 right now." The way she emphasized those last 2 words made every instinct from my military days kick in. This wasn't her usual begging. This was desperation mixed with something else. Something that made me automatically take a step back toward the tool wall. I told her I didn't have that kind of cash on me, which was true. I maybe had $40 in my wallet. She started laughing, but it wasn't a real laugh. More like this broken sound that came out in bursts. "You don't understand," she kept saying, walking deeper into the barn, her sneakers leaving weird smudges on the concrete floor. That's when I noticed the pattern. The prints weren't just dirt, they had this reddish tint that left streaks behind each step. She started grabbing things off the shelves, a rope, some wire cutters, then dropped them like she forgot what she was looking for. "They're coming," she said, spinning around to face me. "I can hear their radios already, can you hear them?" I couldn't hear anything except the calf breathing heavy in its pen and my own heartbeat getting louder in my ears. She pulled something out of her jacket pocket, and for a second I thought it was a gun, but it was just her phone. The screen cracked so bad you could barely see anything on it. She kept pressing buttons that weren't there, her fingers jabbing at nothing, muttering numbers that didn't make sense. The smell hit me then, metallic and thick, like when you butcher a deer and don't clean up right away. It was coming from her clothes, especially that jacket. She must have seen me notice because she suddenly pulled it tighter around herself, even though I could see she was burning up, hair sticking to her neck with sweat. "Frank had an accident," she said. But the way she said accident, drawing it out like she was tasting the word, made my chest tighten. "He fell. In the kitchen. Hit his head on something." She wouldn't look at me when she said it, her eyes fixed on something past my shoulder, out in the darkness beyond the barn door. I asked if we needed to call an ambulance, already reaching for my phone, but she lunged forward and grabbed my wrist with both hands. Her grip was stronger than someone her size should have been capable of, fingernails digging in deep enough that I'd find crescents of dried blood there later. "No ambulance," she hissed. "Just the truck. Please. I'll go to Colorado. I know people there. They'll help me figure this out." That's when we both heard it, sirens still far off but getting closer, that distinctive wail cutting through the night air. Cassie's whole body went rigid, like someone had run electricity through her. She let go of my wrist and bolted for the barn door, but stopped at the threshold, looking out at the darkness. The yard light was motion activated, and it clicked on when she moved, illuminating her in this harsh white glow that made the stains on her clothes look almost purple. "You were always nice to me," she said, not turning around, "even when everyone else crossed the street when they saw me coming. Remember that time you fixed my car? That winter when the radiator cracked?" I did remember. It was 2 years ago, before things got really bad, when she still had moments of being the girl who used to win 4-H competitions and help her mom sell pies at the county fair. She took off running then, not toward the road but into the cornfields, disappearing between the rows that hadn't been harvested yet. The stalks were dry and brittle this late in the season, and I could hear her crashing through them for maybe 30 seconds before the sound faded into nothing. I stood there in the barn for what felt like hours, but was probably only a minute or two, trying to process what had just happened. The sirens were definitely getting closer, and now I could see red and blue lights flickering against the clouds from the direction of the Novak farm. My first thought was to follow her, try to talk sense into her, but something kept me rooted in place. Maybe self-preservation, maybe just the knowledge that whatever had happened at Frank's place, I didn't want to be the one to find out. I walked back to my house, legs feeling like they were made of water, and locked the door behind me for the first time since I'd moved in. Through my kitchen window, I could see the emergency vehicles pulling into Frank's driveway, at least 4 police cars and an ambulance. They didn't use their sirens once they arrived, which somehow made everything worse. Officers with flashlights started spreading out across the property, their beams cutting through the darkness like searchlights. One headed toward the cornfield where Cassie had disappeared, and I found myself holding my breath, waiting for shouts or gunshots or something, but there was just the steady sweep of lights and the occasional crackle of radio chatter that I couldn't quite make out. Around midnight, there was a knock at my door, 3 solid raps that made me jump even though I'd been expecting it. 2 deputies stood on my porch, both young guys who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. The taller one, Officer Daniels according to his name tag, asked if I'd seen Cassie Novak tonight. I hesitated for maybe 2 seconds before telling them everything. Her showing up at the barn, asking for money and my truck, the stains on her clothes, how she'd run into the cornfield. Daniels wrote everything down in this little notebook while the other deputy, Reeves, kept glancing back toward the Novak farm. "Sir, we're going to need you to stay inside tonight," Daniels said when I finished. "Lock your doors and windows. If she comes back, do not let her in. Call 911 immediately." That's when Reeves finally spoke up, his voice barely above a whisper. "Frank Novak is dead. Someone shot him with his own hunting rifle, then beat him with it." The words just hung there in the October air, and I felt something cold settle in my stomach that had nothing to do with the temperature. They found her the next morning almost 10 miles away, walking along County Road 12, in nothing but a t-shirt and jeans. She ditched the green jacket somewhere in the fields. A farmer named Dennis Briggs called it in, said she was just walking down the middle of the road, talking to herself, her feet bloody from running through the harvested cornfields barefoot. The deputies who picked her up said she didn't resist, Just kept asking them if they could stop at McDonald's on the way to the station because she hadn't eaten in 3 days. The full story came out over the next few weeks through the local newspaper and courthouse gossip. She'd been awake for 4 days straight, convinced Frank was poisoning her food, putting cameras in her bedroom, reporting her to the DEA. The prosecution said she'd taken his hunting rifle from the garage, a Winchester Model 70 he'd bought himself for his 60th birthday, waited for him to come home from checking his soybeans, and shot him once in the chest when he walked through his back door. When he didn't die right away, when he tried to crawl toward the phone in the living room, she'd finished it with the rifle butt. The coroner said it took him maybe 20 minutes to die, leaving a trail of blood from the kitchen to the hallway where they found him. The trial lasted 3 days. I had to testify about that night in the barn, sitting in a courtroom that smelled like old wood and floor wax, looking at Cassie in an orange jumpsuit and shackles. She'd gained weight in county jail, her face fuller, her eyes clear for the first time in years. When the prosecutor asked me to describe her state that night, I looked right at her, and she gave me this small nod, like she was giving me permission to tell the truth. Her court-appointed lawyer tried to argue diminished capacity, brought in experts to talk about methamphetamine psychosis, how someone could completely lose touch with reality after days without sleep. But the jury only took 4 hours to come back with guilty on second-degree murder, 25 to life. When they read the verdict, Cassie didn't react at all, just stared at her hands folded on the defendant's table. Her father's sister, Nancy, was the only family member who showed up. She sat in the back row crying quietly into a handkerchief that had little blue flowers embroidered on it. I left Nebraska 2 months after the trial ended. Couldn't handle the empty Novak farmhouse next door, the yellow police tape that stayed up for weeks, the way Frank's soybeans just rotted in the field because no one harvested them. The Brennans understood when I gave my notice, even helped me find a job with a ranch operation in Wyoming. Sometimes I still dream about that night. Not nightmares exactly, just replaying those moments in the barn, wondering if I could have done something different. If I'd given her the truck keys, would Frank still be alive? Or would there have been 2 bodies instead of 1? The detective told me later they found the green jacket she'd been wearing, half buried in a drainage ditch 3 miles from where they picked her up. It was Frank's jacket, one he wore for hunting, and the stains I'd seen were exactly what I'd thought they were. He also told me something that still bothers me. They found my name written on a piece of paper in her pocket, along with 4 other names I didn't recognize. When I asked what that meant, he just shrugged and said they'd probably never know. Cassie took a plea deal to avoid trial for premeditated murder, and she never explained the list. I still wake up sometimes wondering if I was supposed to be next, or if that paper meant something else entirely. Something only a mind twisted by 4 days of sleepless paranoia could understand. Most people dream about retiring to the countryside for peace and quiet, right? Well, let me tell you about the nightmare that unfolded when my wife Jennifer and I bought our little farmhouse in rural Pennsylvania back in 2017. We'd saved for 15 years to escape the city grind. Found this perfect 20-acre property with a renovated 1940s farmhouse, complete with a red barn and a creek running through the back. The realtor mentioned our neighbor to the east, Harold Fitzgerald, had been farming the adjacent land for 40 years, said he was particular about his property lines. That should have been our first warning, but we were too excited about our vegetable garden plans and the chicken coop we wanted to build. The day we moved in, Harold was already standing at our shared fence line with a surveyor's map, explaining exactly where our property ended and his began. Within the first week, Harold had visited us 4 times, each visit more uncomfortable than the last. He'd show up unannounced, always carrying that same laminated survey map, pointing out violations we didn't even know we were committing. Our moving truck had apparently driven 3 feet onto his access road, leaving tire marks he photographed extensively. Jennifer had walked our golden retriever, Bailey, along what we thought was a public path, but Harold produced documents showing he'd purchased those rights in 1993. He spoke in this measured, quiet tone that never quite matched the intensity in his pale blue eyes, like he was struggling to contain something darker. He installed motion sensor lights along our entire shared property line, flooding our bedroom with harsh white light whenever a deer wandered through. When I asked him about it, he said he needed to monitor the boundary integrity and suggested we install blackout curtains if it bothered us. The real problem started about 2 months in, when we decided to repair the old fence on our western boundary. Harold appeared within minutes of the contractor's arrival, demanding to see permits and property surveys, even though the fence was nowhere near his land. He'd installed cameras, we discovered, at least 6 of them that we could count, all aimed at different angles of our property. The contractor, a local guy named Brett, pulled me aside and warned me that Harold had driven off 3 different families from our property over the past decade. Man measures his corn rows with a ruler, Brett said. Filed complaints against the Johnsons because their maple tree dropped leaves on his side. That evening, Harold left a typed letter in our mailbox 3 pages long, detailing the proper protocols for any modifications to our property, including a requirement to notify him 72 hours in advance of any work crews arriving. Things escalated that Friday when Jennifer planted sunflowers along our side of the fence. I was in town getting supplies when Harold confronted her, claiming the flowers would attract birds that might eat his corn seed. Jennifer tried to explain they were 30 feet from his crops, but Harold had already taken dozens of photos, documenting what he called agricultural sabotage. He started showing up at odd hours, sometimes at 5 in the morning, sometimes near midnight, always finding some reason to complain. Our porch light was too bright and disrupted his chickens' laying schedule. Our guests parked too close to the road. The smell from our compost bin was carrying over to his property. He'd stand there with his clipboard, making notes while he talked, never raising his voice, but somehow making every word feel like a threat. The other neighbors, the Andersons to our west, started avoiding us, and I later learned Harold had told them we were problem residents who didn't respect rural traditions. The morning everything changed was a Saturday in late July. I woke up to Jennifer crying in the kitchen, staring out the window at our chicken coop. All 6 of our chickens were dead, arranged in a perfect line along the fence that bordered Harold's property. Their necks had been wrung, and someone had placed them precisely 18 inches apart, measured exactly. I knew it was exact because there was a measuring tape still lying there, one of those old metal ones with HF engraved on the side. When I confronted Harold, he was already in his barn, cleaning his boots with methodical precision. He looked up at me with this blank expression and said, our chickens had been trespassing on his land repeatedly, and that in farming communities there were consequences for poor animal husbandry. He suggested I check my property more carefully, maybe install better fencing, and then went back to cleaning his boots like we'd been discussing the weather. I called the sheriff's office, but Deputy Morrison just looked tired when he arrived. He took photos, made notes, but explained that without direct evidence, there wasn't much he could do. Harold's been here longer than anyone, he said. Never been caught doing anything illegal. That afternoon, I found Harold installing a new camera on a pole right at our property line, this one with a speaker system attached. He waved at me while adjusting the angle, making sure it captured our entire backyard. Jennifer wanted to leave right then, pack everything and go back to the city, but I convinced her we couldn't let him drive us away. We'd invested everything in this place. That night, the speaker crackled to life at 2 in the morning with Harold's voice, informing us that our dog had been barking for approximately 4 minutes, and reminding us about county noise ordinances. Over the next 3 days, Harold's behavior became increasingly erratic and frightening. He started patrolling our fence line every 4 hours, day and night, carrying a long stick that he'd drag along the fence posts, creating this rhythmic metallic sound that echoed across our property. Jennifer found him standing in our vegetable garden one morning, pulling up our tomato plants and examining their roots. When she screamed at him to leave, he calmly explained he was checking for agricultural diseases that might spread to his crops. cited some obscure farming statute from 1952 that he claimed gave him the right. He'd filled our mailbox with printed articles about property disputes that had ended badly, headlines highlighted in yellow marker. One evening, we came home to find he'd spray-painted perfect straight lines across our lawn, marking what he called optimal mowing patterns for rural properties, the paint soaking deep into the grass we'd spent months nurturing. The Andersons finally broke their silence when Harold poisoned their pond. They'd stocked it with bass and bluegill 3 years earlier, and one morning every single fish was floating belly up in water that reeked of industrial pesticide. Harold claimed runoff from their improperly maintained septic system had been contaminating his groundwater, showed them his own water tests that nobody could verify. That same week, the Brennans on the other side of Harold's property found their prized dairy cow dead in the field, foam around its mouth suggesting poisoning. Harold expressed sympathy, mentioned how dangerous wild plants could be if property wasn't properly maintained, offered to help them identify problematic vegetation. The veterinarian found traces of ethylene glycol in the cow's system, basically antifreeze, but again, no proof of how it got there. We all knew, though. We started having meetings at the Anderson place, 5 families comparing notes, realizing Harold had been systematically terrorizing each of us, always staying just within legal boundaries. The breaking point came on a Wednesday morning when I found Bailey convulsing in our yard. Our beautiful golden retriever was dying, white foam around his mouth, his body jerking in ways that still haunt me. Jennifer held him while I drove frantically to the emergency vet, but he died in her arms before we got halfway there. The vet found rat poison in his system, the kind Harold bought in bulk from the farm supply store. When we got home, shattered and empty, Harold was pressure washing his driveway, and he stopped to tell us he'd seen strange dogs around his property lately, suggested we should have kept better control of our animal. The way he said it, with this slight upturn at the corner of his mouth, I knew he wanted me to know it was him. I lunged at him, but Jennifer grabbed my arm and Harold just stood there with the pressure washer still running, daring me to cross onto his property, his finger hovering over his phone to call the police. That night, I couldn't sleep. Just sat on our porch with my father's old hunting rifle across my lap, watching Harold's house. Around 3 in the morning, I saw him walking through our property with a flashlight and what looked like a pesticide sprayer. He was methodically spraying something along the edges of our vegetable garden, taking his time, knowing I was watching. When he saw me stand up, he waved the flashlight in my direction and shouted that he was treating for invasive insects that were threatening his crops, had all the proper documentation if I wanted to check. Jennifer found me at dawn, still sitting there, the rifle now fully loaded, and she knew we'd reached a point where someone was going to die if we didn't do something drastic. The other families were just as desperate. Mrs. Anderson had started having panic attacks, and Brett Brennan was talking about handling things the old way, which scared me almost as much as Harold did. The solution came from the most unexpected place: Harold's own obsession with control. Jennifer had been secretly recording everything for weeks with her phone, but the real breakthrough was when the Brennans' teenage son, Kevin, revealed he'd hacked into Harold's camera system. The old farmer had been recording everything, creating detailed logs of every violation he witnessed, building what he probably thought was evidence against us. But Kevin found something else in those files. Harold had recorded himself poisoning the Andersons' pond, documenting the correct mixture of chemicals to eliminate aquatic trespassing. He'd filmed himself placing tainted meat along our fence line, narrating how this would solve the dog problem permanently. There were dozens of videos, Harold's own voice calmly explaining his actions, justifying every sick thing he'd done as protecting his property rights. The FBI got involved when we found videos suggesting he'd done similar things at his previous farm in Ohio, where a family's house had mysteriously burned down after they'd refused to sell him their land. Harold was arrested on a Sunday morning while adjusting his cameras. He didn't resist, just kept insisting the deputies needed to follow proper procedures, demanding they stay off certain parts of his property even as they put him in handcuffs. The investigation revealed he'd been documenting his harassment campaigns for 23 years, across 4 different states, keeping meticulous records that ultimately became his downfall. He's serving 15 years now in federal prison, and we've slowly started to heal, though Jennifer still can't plant anything near that fence line. The other families stayed, and we became closer than any neighbors I've ever had, bonded by what we survived together. Sometimes I still hear phantom sounds of that stick dragging along the fence posts at night, but it's just the wind. Harold's farm was sold to a young couple from California who turned it into a lavender farm, and the smell drifting over on summer evenings almost makes you forget what happened there. Almost. Sometimes I still drive past that old property line where everything went wrong, and I can't help but remember how normal that Thursday morning started. I was 34, managing my family's wheat farm in eastern Kansas after my dad's stroke left him partially paralyzed. The farm had been in our family for 4 generations, about 800 acres of decent soil that kept us comfortable enough. My wife Laura and I had just celebrated our 10th anniversary, and our twin boys were starting 2nd grade at the local elementary school. Life was predictable in the way that farm life tends to be. You wake up before dawn, check the equipment, monitor the crops, fix whatever broke overnight, and go to bed exhausted but satisfied. That morning I was drinking coffee on the porch, watching the sun paint the wheat fields gold, completely unaware that by nightfall I'd be loading my shotgun and barricading my family inside our house. The Walkers owned the property adjacent to ours, and for as long as anyone could remember, there'd been tension about where exactly our land ended and theirs began. Old Man Walker, that's what everyone called Eugene Walker, even though he was barely 60, had inherited his 1,000 acres from his father, just like I had. The original survey markers from the 1890s had long since disappeared, and both our families had different documents claiming ownership of a strip of land about 40 feet wide and half a mile long that ran between our properties. It sounds like nothing, but that strip had the best soil in the county and access to Millstone Creek, which never ran dry even in the worst droughts. For decades we'd shared an uneasy truce about it. Nobody farmed it, nobody fenced it, and we all pretended it didn't exist. But that morning, as I finished my coffee, I spotted something that made my chest tighten. A line of brand new steel fence posts glinting in the sunrise, marching right down the middle of that disputed strip. I drove my pickup down there, hoping maybe I was seeing things wrong from the distance. But no, there they were. Professional-grade posts sunk deep into the ground, with rolls of wire fencing stacked nearby. Eugene's son, Craig, was there with 2 hired hands stretching measuring tape between posts. Craig was 38, built like a linebacker gone to seed, with these small, mean eyes that always seemed to be calculating something. He'd done 2 tours in Afghanistan and came back different, according to folks in town. Quieter, but with this coiled tension that made people uncomfortable. When he saw me approaching, he straightened up real slow, like he'd been expecting me. The 2 workers, young guys I didn't recognize, probably from a couple counties over, kept working, but I could see them watching us from the corners of their eyes. The morning had gotten humid already, and crickets were screaming in the tall grass, but everything else had gone dead quiet, even the birds. "Morning, neighbor," Craig said, but the way he said neighbor sounded like he was spitting out something bitter. He was wearing a faded green t-shirt with the sleeves cut off, and I could see a tattoo on his shoulder, some kind of military insignia with words in Latin I couldn't read. His hands were covered in fresh dirt, and he kept flexing them while we talked, making the veins in his forearms pop out like rope under his sunburned skin. Dad decided it was time we made things official. Got ourselves a new survey done last month. Professional outfit from Topeka, all legal and proper. Shows this strip belongs to us, always has. He pulled out a folded document from his back pocket, waved it at me but didn't offer to let me read it. The paper looked official enough from where I stood, with a gold seal and everything. But something about how he was smiling, just this slight upturn at the corner of his mouth, made my skin prickle with unease. I told him we'd need to see that survey, maybe get our lawyer involved. And that's when his whole demeanor shifted. The fake friendliness dropped away like a mask falling off, and he stepped closer to me, close enough that I could smell the Copenhagen tobacco on his breath and see the little burst blood vessels in the whites of his eyes. "Your family's been stealing from us for 60 years, he said, voice low and steady. "Taking water that wasn't yours, growing wheat on soil you had no right to. My granddad was too soft to do anything about it, and my dad spent too many years trying to be neighborly. But I'm not them." One of the workers dropped a fence post with a loud clang, and we both turned to look. When I turned back, Craig had pulled out his phone and was taking pictures of me standing there. "For the record," he said, "in case you try anything stupid, we've got cameras up now too, 3 of them with night vision, watching that strip 24/7. The rest of that morning passed in a blur of phone calls, to our family lawyer, to the county clerk's office, to my uncle who dealt with the Walkers back in the 80s. Nobody could give me immediate answers, but everyone said the same thing. Don't do anything rash, let the legal system handle it. Easy for them to say. By noon, the Walkers had strung up half the fence already, and I could see it from my kitchen window. This ugly scar of galvanized steel cutting across land my grandfather had worked with his own hands. Laura kept the boys inside even though they wanted to play in the yard, and she had this worried crease between her eyebrows that only showed up when things were really bad. Around 2 o'clock, I decided to move our tractor to the east field. Needed to disc some ground for winter wheat planting anyway. But when I got to the equipment shed, I could smell it before I saw it. Diesel fuel, everywhere. Someone had punctured the fuel tank on our John Deere, and there was a massive puddle of rainbow-slicked fuel soaking into the dirt floor. The hole in the tank was clean, probably made with a cordless drill. Deliberate, not accidental. Must have happened during the night or early morning before I'd checked the shed. 500 gallons of diesel, at least $3,000 worth, just seeping into the ground. But worse than the money was the message. They could get to our equipment whenever they wanted. I called the sheriff's office and Deputy Martinez came out, took pictures, made a report. But without proof, without cameras of our own, there wasn't much he could do. Could have been vandals, he said, though we both knew better. He'd been called out to the Walker property just last month when Craig beat a door-to-door salesman with a tire iron for trespassing. The guy didn't press charges. Craig's dad paid his medical bills and then some. But everyone knew Craig was capable of violence. Martinez told me to install security cameras, maybe motion lights, and to call immediately if anything else happened. That afternoon, while I was at the farm supply store pricing security systems, Laura called me crying. Really crying, not just upset. She'd gone to check on our chickens and found them all dead. 43 laying hens and our rooster, scattered around the coop like someone had tossed them there. No wounds, no blood, no signs of a predator. The water trough had this oily film on top, and there was a chemical smell she couldn't identify. Poison, had to be. Those birds were her project, something she'd started to bring in extra money selling eggs at the farmer's market. She'd named them all, stupid names like Pecky and Feather Locklear, and the boys helped her collect eggs every morning before school. Now they were just dead bodies that we'd have to burn because we couldn't risk burying poisoned animals where they might contaminate the groundwater. While she was telling me this, I noticed a piece of paper stuck under my windshield wiper. Handwritten in block letters, "Fences make good neighbors, shame about your birds. Worse things happen to stubborn people." I drove home doing 90 on back roads, my knuckles white on the steering wheel. The smart thing would have been to pack up the family and leave for a few days, stay with Laura's parents in town, while lawyers sorted things out. But when you've worked land for 4 generations, when your great-grandfather's sweat is in that soil, you don't just run. Plus, I was angry. The kind of anger that makes you stupid and brave in equal measure. When I got home, Laura had already pulled the boys out of school early and locked all the doors. She'd found another note, this one nailed to our barn door with a 16-penny nail driven so deep, I'd need a crowbar to get it out. "You have until midnight to remove your objections to the fence. Your well water sure would taste funny with the right additives." Our well was 200 feet deep, supplied our house and irrigated 10 acres of vegetables Laura grew. If they poisoned that, we'd be finished. By 6 o'clock, I'd made my decision. Called my brother Glenn, who lived an hour away, told him to come with his hunting rifle and camping gear. Called 2 cousins who'd served in Iraq, asked them to bring whatever they felt comfortable bringing. These weren't violent men, but they were family, and in farm country, that still meant something. We set up in shifts, someone watching the well house, someone watching the equipment shed, someone walking the perimeter with our German shepherd, Duke, who'd been going crazy all day, growling at shadows and barking at nothing. Around 8:30, just as the sun was setting behind the wheat fields, Duke started going absolutely mental near the southern property line. Glenn and I ran down there with flashlights and shotguns, found fresh tire tracks in the soft dirt, and 5 dead crows arranged in a circle around a wooden stake. The stake had another note, "Last warning." The crows' eyes had been removed, just empty sockets staring at nothing, and their feet were tied together with baling twine. At 11:47 p.m., everything went silent, that unnatural kind of quiet where even the insects stopped making noise. Duke, who'd been pacing and whining, suddenly went still and pointed toward the access road. Through the darkness, we could see headlights approaching with their high beams off, just the dim yellow of old fog lights. 3 vehicles, 2 pickups and what looked like an old Bronco, creeping along at maybe 5 miles per hour. They stopped about 100 yards from our house, engines still running, and we could see cigarette cherries glowing as people got out. My cousin Rodney had his night vision scope from his military days, and he counted 8 men, all carrying something. "They've got jerry cans," he whispered. And I think, yeah, that's definitely a rifle on the tall one. We were outnumbered, but we had the defensive position and they didn't know we were ready for them. Glenn chambered around in his 30-06, the sound carrying clear across the field. The vehicles immediately killed their engines, and we heard doors slamming, urgent whispers, then Craig's voice cutting through the darkness. "Just wanting to talk, neighbor. No need for anyone to get hurt tonight." But they didn't approach, didn't move forward. They stayed by their vehicles for maybe 10 minutes, occasionally flashing lights toward the house, toward the barn, toward the well house where my other cousin was hidden. Then, just as suddenly as they'd come, they loaded back up and left, driving fast this time, kicking up dust that glowed red in their taillights. We stayed on watch until dawn, jumping at every sound, but they never came back. Found out later from Deputy Martinez that someone had called in an anonymous tip about armed men threatening violence at the Walkers' property, except the caller gave our address instead. If the sheriff had shown up and found us armed to the teeth, it would have looked like we were the aggressors. But Martinez knew both families, knew the history, and he'd driven by the Walkers' place first, seen their vehicles weren't there, and figured out what was really happening. The next morning, something strange happened. Old man Walker himself showed up at our door alone, looking about 10 years older than the last time I'd seen him. His hands were shaking as he held his John Deere cap, and there were dark circles under his eyes like he hadn't slept either. "I didn't know," he said, voice cracking. "About the chickens, the tractor, none of it. Craig, he's not well, not since he came back. I found the jerry cans in the barn this morning, found the receipts for the cameras, the poison." He pulled out a thick envelope from his jacket, handed it to me with trembling fingers. "That's $20,000. For the damages, the diesel, the birds, and then some. I'm sending Craig away to his uncle's place in Arizona. Already got him on a bus this morning. Told him if he comes back, I'm writing him out of the will." He looked at the disputed strip of land, visible from our porch where that new fence stood like an accusation. "I'll take it down. The fence. Today. We'll go back to how it was. Nobody farms it, nobody claims it. Maybe our grandkids can figure it out someday when we're all gone." I wanted to stay angry, wanted to refuse his money and demand justice, but looking at that broken old man, I just felt tired. We took the money, watched him spend the afternoon pulling up fence posts by himself, Craig's hired hands nowhere to be seen. Laura and I used part of the money to install a serious security system, cameras covering every angle, motion sensors, the works. We never saw Craig again, though sometimes cars would slow down near our property line at night, and we'd wonder. The disputed strip grew wild with prairie grass and wildflowers, like maybe that's what it was always supposed to be. The Walkers sold their place 2 years later to a corporate farming operation out of Texas, and Eugene died of a heart attack 6 months after that. People in town said it was the stress of what Craig had become, the shame of it. I still farm that land, still check those cameras every night before bed. And sometimes when I'm out working near that strip of wild ground, I think about how thin the line is between neighbors and enemies, how a 40-foot piece of dirt can turn normal people into something else entirely, something capable of things they'd never imagined. The farmhouse stood about 40 minutes outside of town, surrounded by cornfields that stretched endlessly in every direction. I was 21, finishing my junior year at State University, and when my roommates Jordan and Blake found this rental listing for dirt cheap, we jumped on it immediately. The place was ancient, probably built in the 1940s with creaking wooden floors and windows that rattled whenever the wind picked up. But it had 4 bedrooms, a massive kitchen with one of those old cast-iron stoves, and rent that was less than what we'd been paying for our cramped apartment near campus. We moved in during early May, right after finals, planning to stay through the summer while we worked our internships. The isolation felt peaceful at first, therapeutic even, after months of dormitory chaos and constant noise from other students. Our nearest neighbors lived in a double-wide trailer about 200 yards away, separated from our property by a deteriorating chicken wire fence that barely stood 5 feet tall. From day one, we could hear them arguing, violent, screaming matches that echoed across the empty fields between us. The man had a voice like gravel being crushed, deep and threatening, while the woman's shrieks would pierce through our walls even with all the windows closed. Sometimes we'd hear glass breaking, furniture being thrown, doors slamming so hard the sound would make us jump. Jordan kept saying we should call someone, but Blake always talked him out of it, insisting it wasn't our business, that getting involved with neighbors like that only meant trouble. I agreed with Blake, honestly. These people seemed dangerous, unpredictable, and the last thing we needed was to make enemies with the only other humans for miles around. The particular night everything went wrong started like any other. It was a Tuesday in late June, humid and sticky, with thunderclouds building on the horizon but never quite delivering the rain we desperately needed. I'd gotten home from my internship at the Agricultural Extension Office around 6, exhausted from spending the day cataloging soil samples in a warehouse without air conditioning. Jordan was already cooking dinner, his famous spaghetti with meat sauce that was really just ground beef and jarred marinara, but we acted like it was gourmet. Blake was out on the front porch, smoking cigarettes and scrolling through his phone, occasionally shouting commentary about whatever video he was watching. The neighbors had been quiet all day, which should have been my first warning sign. In the 3 weeks since we'd moved in, there hadn't been a single day without at least one screaming match from that trailer. But that evening, nothing. Just the sound of crickets and the distant rumble of thunder that never got any closer. Around 11:30, I was lying in bed, trying to fall asleep despite the suffocating heat. Our ancient window unit AC had died the week before, and the landlord kept promising to fix it real soon. I had my window cracked open, hoping for even the slightest breeze when I heard it. The unmistakable sound of metal being cut. It was rhythmic, deliberate, like someone working with wire cutters or tin snips. At first, I convinced myself it was just the storm finally rolling in, maybe wind catching something metal outside. But the sound continued, steady and purposeful, and it was coming from the direction of that chicken wire fence. I sat up in bed, straining to see through the darkness outside my window. The moon was hidden behind clouds, and all I could make out were vague shapes and shadows moving where they shouldn't be moving. I crept out of bed, careful not to make the floorboards creak, and made my way to Jordan's room down the hall. His door was slightly open, and I could see him sitting up in bed, his face illuminated by his phone screen. "You hear that?" I whispered, and he nodded, eyes wide. We both moved to his window, which had a better view of the fence line. That's when we saw them, 3 figures working on the fence with what looked like bolt cutters. They were methodical, cutting through section after section, creating an opening large enough for a person to walk through. One of them kept looking back toward the trailer, like he was checking to make sure no one was watching from there. Another one was wearing something reflective, maybe a watch or a chain, that caught what little light there was each time he moved. The third guy was massive, probably 6'4" or 6'5", with shoulders that looked like he could flip a car if he wanted to. They weren't trying to be quiet either, which somehow made it worse. They knew no one would stop them. Blake must have heard us moving around, because suddenly he was in the doorway, asking what was going on in his usual too loud voice. Jordan and I both shushed him frantically, pointing toward the window. When Blake saw what was happening, his whole demeanor changed. He pulled out his phone, hands trembling as he dialed 911. The dispatcher asked a million questions. Our address, how many intruders, were they armed? Were we in immediate danger? Blake kept his voice low, barely above a whisper, giving her all the information while Jordan and I watched the men finish cutting through the fence. They stepped through the opening they'd created, and that's when my whole body went rigid with fear. They weren't heading toward the trailer. They were walking straight toward our house, spreading out as they moved, like they'd done this before and knew exactly how to surround a building. The dispatcher was still asking questions, but Blake had gone silent, just staring out the window. I grabbed the phone from him and whispered that 3 men had cut through our fence and were approaching our house right now. She said units were on the way, maybe 15 minutes out. 15 minutes. In that moment, 15 minutes felt like 15 hours. The big guy was heading toward our back door, the one that led into the kitchen. The other 2 were splitting up, one going left toward the garage, the other right toward the front porch. We could hear their footsteps on the gravel driveway, slow and deliberate. Jordan ran downstairs to check the locks, and I heard him cursing because the back door's deadbolt had been broken since we moved in, another thing the landlord promised to fix. All we had was the regular lock on the doorknob, the kind you could probably break with one solid kick. Blake was frantically looking for something to defend ourselves with, but what did we have? Kitchen knives? A baseball bat Jordan brought for the recreational softball league he never joined? Then came the sound that still wakes me up some nights, the doorknob on the back door slowly turning. Just a subtle squeak of metal on metal, but in that silent house it sounded like a scream. The knob turned all the way, hit the lock, and stopped. There was a pause, maybe 3 seconds that felt like 3 years. Then the door shook as someone pulled on it hard, testing it. Jordan was down there alone, and I could hear him breathing heavy, probably standing just feet away from whoever was on the other side of that door. The pulling stopped, and then we heard voices, low and muffled, like they were discussing something. One of them laughed. Not a normal laugh, but something guttural and mean. The kind of laugh that comes right before someone does something terrible. The front door handle started turning too, and that's when Blake completely lost it, screaming at the top of his lungs for them to get away, that the police were coming, that we had guns even though we definitely didn't. Everything erupted into chaos after Blake's outburst. The men outside started pounding on both doors simultaneously, violent banging that shook the entire house. I could hear wood splintering around the back door frame where Jordan was, and he came running up the stairs, taking them 3 at a time. His face was white as paper, and he kept saying the door was about to give. We barricaded ourselves in Blake's room, shoving his dresser against the door, then his desk, then anything else we could move. The pounding downstairs got louder, more aggressive, and then we heard glass shatter. The kitchen window. They were coming in. I remember thinking about every horror movie I'd ever watched, how I always said the characters were stupid for not fighting back or having a plan. But in that moment, all I could do was stand there paralyzed, listening to the sound of feet hitting our kitchen floor. Heavy boots, multiple sets, moving through the house we'd been living in for barely a month. The footsteps stopped at the bottom of the stairs and we could hear them talking. One voice was saying something about checking upstairs, another mentioned the car in the driveway, and the third one, the deep voice, kept repeating that we needed to learn to mind our own business. That phrase stuck with me because we hadn't done anything. We'd never called the cops on the neighbors, never complained, never even made eye contact with them the few times we'd seen them outside. Then the stairs started creaking under someone's weight, slow and deliberate, like they wanted us to hear them coming. Blake was on the phone with 911 again, practically sobbing, telling them someone was in our house, they were coming upstairs, please hurry. Jordan had found a crowbar in Blake's closet from some project he'd never finished, and he stood facing the door, gripping it so tight his knuckles were white. The footsteps reached the landing, and we could hear breathing on the other side of our makeshift barricade. The doorknob rattled, then someone pushed against the door, testing the barricade. The dresser moved maybe an inch, and all three of us threw our weight against it, pushing back. The person on the other side laughed again, that same horrible sound from before, and said something like, "3 little college boys want to play tough." Then came a massive impact, like someone had thrown their entire body against the door. The dresser shifted, the desk behind it scraped across the floor, and a gap opened up just wide enough for me to see an eye peering through. Bloodshot, dilated, wild. The pupil was so enlarged it looked completely black, and there were broken blood vessels all around the iris. That eye locked onto mine for what couldn't have been more than 2 seconds, but I can still see it perfectly when I close my eyes. Then suddenly sirens, distant but getting louder fast. The eye disappeared and we heard rapid footsteps going back down the stairs, voices shouting to each other, the back door slamming open so hard it hit the wall. We stayed barricaded in that room even after we saw the police lights flooding through the window, red and blue painting everything in alternating colors. It took the officers actually announcing themselves, showing badges through the gap in the door, before we finally started moving the furniture. They found the men about a quarter mile away, trying to cross through a cornfield to get to a truck they'd parked on some agricultural access road. All three were arrested. Turns out they were high on methamphetamine, carrying hunting knives, more drugs, and had been casing our house for days because they thought we were dealing. Apparently, college kids renting a remote farmhouse fit some profile in their drug-addled minds. The neighbors in the trailer, they'd left 2 days before after a particularly bad fight, and these guys had been squatting there watching us, planning this. The police said we were lucky, that meth psychosis mixed with weapons usually doesn't end with everyone walking away unharmed. I finished my internship sleeping on a friend's couch in town. Jordan and Blake broke the lease the next day. None of us ever went back to pack properly. We hired movers to get our stuff while a police officer supervised. I still have nightmares about that eye in the gap, still jump when I hear doorknobs turn, still can't live anywhere that doesn't have a deadbolt, a chain, and preferably a security system. It was the middle of August 2016 when everything happened, and I was 12 years old, spending another long afternoon at our family's farm outside Riverside while my parents drove into town for supplies. We lived about 20 minutes from the nearest grocery store, down a gravel road that kicked up dust clouds whenever anyone drove past, which wasn't often. I remember sitting on our front porch that day, reading one of those young adult novels about kids solving mysteries, completely absorbed in the story while our tabby cat, Whiskers, dozed in a patch of sunlight near my feet. The cicadas were buzzing so loud it almost hurt your ears, and the air was thick with humidity that made your clothes stick to your skin the moment you stepped outside. When I heard footsteps on the gravel, I looked up to see Mr. Donovan walking up our driveway, and my first thought was relief because I knew him from church. He ran the hardware store downtown and always gave me butterscotch candies when my dad brought me along to buy supplies. He was wearing his usual plaid shirt, but it was untucked and wrinkled, and his gray hair looked messier than normal, like he'd been running his fingers through it over and over again. He gave me this big smile when he saw me, the kind adults do when they're trying to seem friendly, but something's bothering them, and asked if my parents were home. When I told him they'd gone to town, he asked if he could use our phone because his truck broke down about a mile up the road, and his cell phone was dead. which made sense because nobody got good reception out here anyway. I let him inside because that's what you do when someone you know needs help, especially someone who's been nothing but kind to you for years. The landline was in the kitchen, mounted on the wall next to the refrigerator covered in my school papers and family photos from last Christmas. Mr. Donovan followed me inside, and I noticed he kept glancing out the window, checking the driveway like he was expecting someone. He picked up the phone receiver, held it to his ear for a moment, then set it back down without dialing anything. "Actually, sweetie," he said, and his voice sounded different, tighter somehow. "Would it be all right if I got a glass of water first? That walk in this heat really got to me." I went to the cabinet to grab a glass, and when I turned back around, he wasn't in the kitchen anymore. I found him standing by the living room window, peering through the curtains at something outside, and that's when I started getting this uncomfortable feeling in my chest, like when you know you're about to get in trouble but you're not sure why yet. He must have heard me because he turned around quickly and gave me that same too big smile, saying he thought he heard his buddy's truck coming to pick him up, but it must have been nothing. The way he kept moving around our house, touching things, running his hand along the back of our couch, picking up and setting down the ceramic rooster my mom collected, reminded me of how our dog acted during thunderstorms, all restless energy with nowhere to go. He asked if my parents said when they'd be back, and when I told him probably another hour or two, he nodded like he was doing math in his head, calculating something I couldn't understand. That's when we both heard it, the sound of tires on gravel, multiple vehicles from the sound of it coming fast down our driveway. Mr. Donovan's whole body went rigid, and the color drained from his face so quickly, it was like watching someone age 10 years in a second. Through the window, I could see 2 sheriff's department cars pulling up to our house, their lights flashing but no sirens, and my first thought was that something had happened to my parents. But Mr. Donovan grabbed my shoulder, not hard enough to hurt but firm enough to get my attention, and said in this low, urgent voice, "Listen, honey, those officers are confused about something. I need to step out back for just a minute to avoid any misunderstanding, okay? Can you tell them nobody's here?" His fingers were trembling against my shoulder, and there were beads of sweat rolling down his temples, even though our air conditioning was running full blast. Before I could answer or even process what he was asking me to do, he was already moving toward our back door, the one that led out toward the barn and the chicken coops. The doorbell rang, followed by heavy knocking, and I stood there in our living room, my mind racing between answering the door and following Mr. Donovan to ask what was happening. Through the front window, I could see 2 deputies standing on our porch, their hands resting on their belts in that casual but ready way cops always seem to stand. One of them, a woman with her hair pulled back in a tight bun, saw me through the window and gave me a small wave, mouthing, "It's okay," through the glass. Mr. Donovan had already disappeared through the back door, and I watched through the kitchen window as he jogged toward our barn, looking back at the house every few steps like a spooked deer. I opened the front door because I didn't know what else to do, and the female deputy immediately crouched down to my eye level, her voice calm and steady like she was trying not to spook me. "Hi there, sweetheart. I'm Deputy Morrison and this is Deputy Tanner. Are your parents home?" When I shook my head no, she asked if any adults were with me, and I hesitated for just a second too long before saying no. Deputy Tanner, a younger man with a sunburn across his nose, must have caught that hesitation because he exchanged a quick glance with Deputy Morrison. She asked if they could come inside to make sure everything was okay, and as they stepped into our living room, I noticed how their eyes swept every corner, taking in details I'd never paid attention to. The back door slightly ajar, Mr. Donovan's muddy footprints on our hardwood floor, the glass of water I'd gotten him still sitting untouched on the kitchen counter. Deputy Morrison asked me gentle questions while Deputy Tanner walked through our house, checking rooms with practiced efficiency. Had anyone been here today? Did I know a man named Carl Donovan? Was I hurt or scared? The questions came soft but steady, and with each one, I felt like the floor was tilting beneath me because I was starting to understand that Mr. Donovan, the man who'd sold my dad lumber and taught my Sunday school class 2 years ago, had lied to me about everything. Deputy Tanner came back from checking the bedrooms and whispered something to Deputy Morrison, who nodded and spoke into her radio, calling for backup to check the property's outbuildings. Through the kitchen window, I could see our barn door was slightly open, just a crack, but enough that I knew Mr. Donovan was in there, probably crouched behind the hay bales or up in the loft where we stored old furniture. More deputies arrived within minutes, and they moved across our property like they'd rehearsed it 100 times, spreading out to surround the barn while Deputy Morrison stayed with me in the living room. She kept talking to me in that same calm voice, explaining that Mr. Donovan needed to answer some questions about something that had happened in town, but I could barely focus on her words because I was watching through the window as 4 officers positioned themselves around the barn's exits. One of them had a megaphone and called out for Mr. Donovan to come out with his hands visible, that they just wanted to talk. But the barn stayed silent except for our rooster, who chose that exact moment to crow from his pen nearby. The waiting felt endless, like those seconds between lightning and thunder when you're counting to see how close the storm is. And I kept thinking about all the times Mr. Donovan had been at our house before, helping my dad fix the fence, bringing us fresh eggs from his chickens, always so normal and friendly. Then I saw him emerge from the barn's side door, the one we hardly ever used because it stuck in the frame, and you had to shoulder it hard to get it open. His hands were raised above his head, and even from inside the house I could see his shoulders shaking. The deputies moved in quickly but carefully, and within seconds they had him in handcuffs, leading him toward one of the patrol cars. As they walked him past our kitchen window, Mr. Donovan looked right at me, and his face had this expression I'll never forget. Not anger or fear, but something like disappointment, like I'd let him down by not lying for him. Deputy Morrison must have seen me staring because she gently turned me away from the window and asked if I wanted to call my parents, but my throat felt so tight I could only nod. My parents came home in a rush of slamming car doors and panicked voices, and my mom held me so tight I could barely breathe while my dad talked to the deputies outside. Later, after all the police cars had left and we were sitting around our kitchen table eating takeout Chinese food, because nobody felt like cooking, they told me what Deputy Morrison had explained to them. Mr. Donovan had been embezzling money from 3 different churches in the county, including ours, taking small amounts from donation funds over the past 5 years, not enough for anyone to notice right away, but it added up to nearly $40,000. That morning, the church treasurer had finally discovered the discrepancies and called the police, and Mr. Donovan must have seen the patrol cars at his house when he drove past. Instead of turning himself in, he'd abandoned his truck down the road and walked to our farm, probably thinking he could hide out until dark and then slip away, using me and our house as cover while he figured out his next move. What haunts me most about that day isn't the fear I felt when I realized something was wrong, or even the shock of learning that someone I trusted had been lying to everyone for years. It's the way he acted so normal at first, relying on my familiarity with him, counting on a 12-year-old's instinct to help someone they knew. My parents installed better locks after that, and got me a cell phone earlier than they'd planned, but the real change was inside me. That little voice that now questions things, that notices when someone's story doesn't quite add up, that understands how someone can use your trust like a tool. The church got most of the money back through insurance, and Mr. Donovan went to prison for 3 years, but I still think about that afternoon sometimes, especially when I drive past our old barn, remembering how thin the line is between the people we think we know and who they really are when they're desperate. I grew up in a small rural town where everybody knew each other's routines without even trying. At that time, I was working at the feed store on Main Street, so I saw most of the farmers and their families come through at least once a week. One couple stood out more than the rest, Thomas and his wife, Linda. They lived on the far edge of town, close to the tree line where the fields started giving way to swampy ground. He was quiet, kept to himself, but she was the one who'd always show up at the market with baskets of eggs and jars of preserves. Linda had this habit of wearing bright scarves, even when the weather didn't call for it, as if she wanted a piece of color with her wherever she went. After a while, people started noticing she wasn't around as much. At first, nobody said anything. It's not unusual for folks to skip a week or two at the market if things are busy on the farm. But when a month rolled by without Linda showing up, whispers started circling. What stuck with me was the last time I saw her. She came into the store alone, moving slower than usual, and I caught sight of a dark bruise peeking out from under her scarf. She tugged it higher the moment she realized I noticed. She gave me a nod and didn't say much, just bought a few bags of feed and left. That image stuck with me like a photograph burned into my head. The rumors grew heavier when folks mentioned hearing shouting late at night from their property. Some said they saw Linda in the yard days after, looking pale, like she hadn't slept. One neighbor claimed she heard a crash loud enough to wake her dogs, followed by silence that felt unnatural. People started connecting the dots, but no one wanted to accuse Thomas outright. He had a reputation for being territorial. He'd bark at anyone who so much as stepped a boot onto his land. He had already fought with neighbors about fencing and livestock straying onto his pasture, and his temper seemed to get worse after Linda disappeared from public view. I tried to push it out of my mind until one afternoon Thomas stormed into the store, red-faced, demanding to know who had been snooping around his property. His voice carried through the aisles, sharp and threatening, and even old Mr. Hanley, who'd been in town longer than anyone, avoided eye contact. Thomas's hands were calloused and cracked, and he slammed them on the counter when I tried to explain nobody had been on his land. There was something in the way he glared at me that made me realize this wasn't just about property lines anymore. It felt like he was daring anyone to question what had happened to Linda. Things escalated fast after that. A couple of weeks later, Thomas was standing at the edge of the Simmons property, screaming about their goats crossing the fence line. The Simmons' youngest boy told me later he'd never seen a man so furious, veins bulging in his neck as he waved a rusted pitchfork like it was a weapon. People started avoiding that stretch of road, even in broad daylight. What unsettled me the most was how empty his farm looked now. The laundry line that Linda used to hang with bright scarves and dresses stayed bare, swaying in the wind, like it was waiting for something that would never return. One evening I stayed late at the store closing up and noticed Thomas's truck parked near the church lot, engine running with no lights on. It sat there for nearly an hour before finally pulling away. The next morning, Pastor Collins mentioned finding boot prints circling the building. They didn't lead anywhere, just loops around the back near the windows. It put the whole town on edge. People were locking their doors earlier, drawing curtains tight, things we didn't normally do in a place where most folks left their keys under flower pots. The sheriff finally paid Thomas a visit, but it didn't calm anyone down. Word spread that he had shouted at the deputy until his face turned purple, accusing everyone of conspiring against him. The strangest part was how quiet the farm remained otherwise. No sign of Linda, no animals grazing near the fences, no movement around the barn. From the road, it looked like a stage set left behind after the actors walked out. That eerie stillness made the rumors louder. Some swore they'd heard a woman's voice crying in the night. Others claimed to see a shadow moving inside the farmhouse window when Thomas was in town. I couldn't shake the memory of Linda's last visit to the store, the way her eyes darted like she was searching for someone safe to talk to, and how quickly she disappeared after paying. Every time I thought about it, I wondered if that was her silent way of asking for help, and I just didn't catch on soon enough. It's hard to explain, but from that moment on, the air in our little town felt heavier, like we were all waiting for a truth too ugly to admit. Nobody dared confront him directly, but the silence from that farm spoke louder than any accusation we could have made. It was late autumn when everything came to a head. The leaves had turned brittle, and the air carried that sharp chill that seeps into your bones. I remember driving past Thomas's farm after dropping off a delivery, and the sight stopped me cold. The front door stood wide open, swaying slightly in the wind. No truck in the driveway, no sound from inside. For a man as paranoid as him, leaving his door open was unthinkable. I parked down the road and called the sheriff before even stepping closer. A few other neighbors gathered, drawn by the same uneasy curiosity. No one wanted to go in, but none of us could leave either. When the deputies arrived, they moved carefully through the house. We waited outside in silence, every creak of the old boards inside carrying across the yard. After what felt like forever, they came back out with strained expressions. They wouldn't share much, just said the place was in disarray. Later, we heard from one of the deputies' cousins that the upstairs bedroom was torn apart, dresser drawers yanked out, clothes scattered everywhere, but not a trace of Linda. In the cellar, they found muddy boots and a torn scarf caught on a nail, bright red like the ones she always wore. That detail spread through town faster than any official statement ever could. Thomas never returned. His truck was found abandoned near the river a week later, keys still in the ignition. Search teams combed the woods and dragged the water, but they didn't recover a body. What unsettled me most was how quickly the authorities seemed to want the whole thing to go quiet. They boarded up the farmhouse and locked the gate, as if sealing away questions they didn't want to answer. The land stayed untouched, weeds growing high, windows staring blankly like eyes watching the road. Some people whispered that Linda's family knew more than they let on, but no proof ever surfaced. The silence from everyone involved was louder than shouting. Even now, years later, whenever I drive past that overgrown stretch of land, I think about Linda's last look at me in the store, and how maybe she had been reaching out in her own quiet way. Our town still doesn't speak openly about it. We avoid the topic like a wound that never healed. I carry the weight of wondering whether I should have done something when I saw that bruise, when I noticed the scarves pulled too high on her neck. Maybe it wouldn't have changed anything. Maybe it would have. What I do know is that both of them vanished, and the ground they left behind feels haunted, not by ghosts, but by secrets buried too deep for anyone to admit. Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. October 31st, 2016 was supposed to be just another easy night of making extra cash. I was 19, a sophomore at the local community college, and babysitting for the Bradshaw family had become my regular weekend gig. They lived in one of those quiet suburban neighborhoods where the biggest drama was usually someone forgetting to bring their trash cans in. Mr. and Mrs. Bradshaw were heading to some fancy corporate Halloween party downtown, and they needed someone to watch their two kids, Jamie, who was 8, and little Sophia, barely 5. The pay was good, $50 plus whatever leftovers they had in the fridge, and the kids were usually asleep by 9 anyway. I remember thinking it would be the easiest money I'd ever make, just sitting there watching Netflix while handing out candy to trick-or-treaters. The Bradshaws left around 7:30, Mrs. Bradshaw doing that typical parent thing, where she wrote down 5 different phone numbers even though I already had her cell saved in my contacts. The kids were hyped up on pre-Halloween candy their grandma had sent them, running around in their costumes. Jamie was some superhero I didn't recognize, and Sophia was a princess with a tiara that kept sliding off her head. I managed to corral them onto the couch with the promise of watching Hocus Pocus, and for about an hour, everything was completely normal. Trick-or-treaters came in waves, groups of kids with pillowcases and plastic pumpkins, parents hovering at the end of the driveway with flashlights. I was actually enjoying myself, remembering how much fun Halloween used to be when I was their age, before everything got complicated with college applications and part-time jobs and all that adult stuff that suddenly seemed to matter so much. Around 9 o'clock, after I'd gotten both kids into their pajamas and tucked into Jamie's room, Sophia insisted on sleeping in her brother's bed during scary nights. I noticed this person in a clown costume standing at the corner of the property, right where the Bradshaws' lawn met the sidewalk. At first, I didn't think much of it. Halloween brings out all kinds of weird costumes, and teenagers especially love going overboard with the creepy stuff. But this clown wasn't moving with a group, wasn't carrying a candy bag, wasn't doing anything really except standing there. The costume itself was disturbing in its simplicity, a dirty white jumpsuit with pom-poms down the front, and this mask that even from the living room window I could tell was different from the cheap ones they sell at party stores. The features were too elongated, the smile too wide, painted in this faded red that looked brown under the streetlight. I texted my boyfriend Nathan around 9:15. "There's this creepy clown outside the house I'm babysitting at. He's just standing there." Nathan, being Nathan, immediately called me instead of texting back, and I remember whispering into the phone even though the kids were upstairs and couldn't hear me. He told me to call the cops if the guy didn't leave soon, but I felt stupid making that call. What was I gonna say that someone in a Halloween costume was standing on a public sidewalk? While I was talking to Nathan, I walked from room to room, checking all the windows, and that's when I realized the clown wasn't just standing in one spot anymore. He was walking a slow circle around the house, maintaining the same distance from the walls, like he was tracing some invisible boundary. Each window I looked through, I'd catch a glimpse of him passing by, that mask turning slightly toward the house each time, never fully facing forward, always keeping the house in his peripheral vision. Nathan stayed on the phone with me for another 20 minutes, and during that time, the clown completed maybe 3 full circles around the house. I started timing them. Each lap took about 6 minutes, always the same pace, never speeding up or slowing down. The trick-or-treaters had thinned out by then, just the occasional group of older kids without costumes looking for last-minute candy, and none of them seemed to notice or care about the clown. I kept thinking maybe it was some elaborate prank. Maybe one of the Bradshaw's neighbors hired someone to add atmosphere to the neighborhood or something. But there was something mechanical about his movement, something practiced and deliberate that made my chest feel tight. I told Nathan I was going to try something, and I turned off the porch light, the universal signal that we were out of candy. The clown stopped mid-stride when the light went out, stood perfectly still for maybe 10 seconds, then continued his circle like nothing had happened. By 9:45, I was genuinely scared. I double-checked all the locks, closed all the curtains except for a small gap I was using to watch him, and I'd moved into the kitchen where I could see both the front and back doors. Nathan was trying to keep me calm, suggesting maybe the guy was high or drunk, just some weirdo who would eventually get bored and leave. But then I noticed something that made me actually gasp out loud. The clown had something in his hand that I hadn't seen before, or maybe he'd just pulled it out. It was a phone, and he was holding it up, not like he was texting or calling someone, but like he was recording. He was filming the house as he walked, the phone's screen casting this sick blue glow on the lower part of his mask. I immediately thought about the kids upstairs, about how their room faced the street, and I ran up to make sure their curtains were closed. They were both sleeping soundly, Jamie sprawled out with one arm hanging off the bed, Sophia curled up against him sucking her thumb. I stood there for a moment, listening to their breathing, wondering if I should wake them up and bring them downstairs with me. I decided against waking the kids. They were safer not knowing what was happening, I figured. When I got back to the kitchen, Nathan was practically yelling through the phone, asking if I was okay because I'd gone quiet for too long. I told him about the filming, and that's when he said he was coming over. He lived about 15 minutes away, and I remember feeling both relieved and more anxious somehow, like his coming over made this whole thing more real, more serious. I gave him the address again, even though he'd dropped me off there before, and then I went back to my spot by the kitchen window. The clown had changed his pattern. Instead of walking continuous circles, he would now stop at each corner of the house and stand there for exactly 30 seconds. I counted, before moving to the next corner. At each stop, he would slowly turn his head from left to right. That phone held steady, recording everything. 10:13 is when everything went wrong. I remember the exact time because I was texting Nathan asking how far away he was, and he said he was parking down the street because he didn't want to pull into the driveway and potentially escalate things with the clown. I was typing back, "Please hurry," when I heard the basement door open. Not the outside basement door, the one inside the house, the one that connected the basement to the hallway near the bathroom. My whole body went rigid. The Bradshaws had mentioned that door sometimes didn't latch properly, that you really had to push it closed, but I knew I hadn't been in the basement at all that night. I stood there in the kitchen, phone in one hand, a knife from the drawer in the other. When had I grabbed that? Listening to footsteps that were definitely coming from inside the house. Slow, deliberate steps, not trying to be quiet exactly, but not making extra noise either. The footsteps stopped at the bottom of the main stairs, the ones that led up to where the kids were sleeping, and I knew I had to move. I dropped my phone on the kitchen counter. It made this awful clattering sound that seemed impossibly loud, and ran for the stairs. My socks slipped on the hardwood floor as I rounded the corner, and I could hear those footsteps behind me now, faster, taking the stairs 2 at a time. I burst into Jamie's room and slammed the door behind me, turning the lock with shaking fingers. The kids woke up confused, Sophia starting to cry, and I pulled them both into Jamie's closet, whispering that we were playing a game, a Halloween game where we had to hide really quietly. Jamie was old enough to know something was wrong, his eyes wide in the darkness of the closet, but he held his sister tight and didn't say a word. Through the closet door, I could hear footsteps in the hallway, slow again, stopping at each door. The handle of Jamie's room jiggled once, twice, then nothing. Just breathing on the other side of the door, raspy and deliberately loud, like whoever it was wanted us to know they were there. The silence stretched out for what felt like hours but was probably only 2 or 3 minutes. Then I heard Nathan's voice from downstairs, shouting my name, saying the front door was wide open. The footsteps in the hallway moved fast then, running toward the stairs, and I heard Nathan yell something I couldn't make out, followed by what sounded like furniture falling over. I wanted to leave the closet, wanted to help, but Sophia was clinging to me so tight I could barely breathe, and Jamie was whispering, "Don't leave us, please don't leave us," over and over. We heard more crashing, the sound of glass breaking, Nathan's voice getting more distant like he was chasing someone outside. Then suddenly everything went quiet. Not normal quiet, that awful, heavy kind of quiet where you can hear your own heartbeat and nothing else. I kept the kids in that closet for another 15 minutes, until we heard sirens and saw red and blue lights flashing through the bedroom window. Only then did I open the closet door, carrying Sophia while Jamie held onto the back of my shirt, and we made our way downstairs to where 2 police officers were standing in the destroyed living room, Nathan sitting on the couch with a bloody nose, and no sign of anyone in a clown costume anywhere. The police searched the entire neighborhood that night, but they never found whoever was in that clown costume. Nathan told them he'd chased the person through the backyard and into the wooded area behind the houses, but lost them in the darkness. The really disturbing part came when they checked the basement. The lock on the exterior basement door had been picked, and there were muddy footprints showing someone had been down there for a while, maybe even before I arrived that evening. They found my phone in the kitchen where I'd left it, still recording a video I didn't remember starting. When the detective played it back, you could hear me talking to Nathan, then the door opening, my footsteps running, and then about 4 minutes of just breathing. That same raspy breathing I'd heard outside Jamie's door. The Bradshaws came home to find their house swarming with police, and Mrs. Bradshaw just held her kids and cried, while Mr. Bradshaw kept apologizing to me, like any of this was somehow their fault. They moved out 3 months later, said they couldn't stand being in that house anymore. For years I had nightmares about that mask, about those mechanical circles around the house, about what would have happened if Nathan hadn't shown up when he did. I moved away for college, tried to put it all behind me, but Halloween always brought it back. Then, about 2 years ago, I got a call from Nathan. He still lived in our hometown, had actually bought a house about 6 blocks from where the Bradshaws used to live. He was doing some landscaping in his backyard, planning to put in a pool, when his shovel hit something hard about 3 feet down. It was wrapped in plastic, a garbage bag duct taped into a bundle. Inside was that clown mask, unmistakable with its elongated features and faded red smile, along with a white jumpsuit and something else that made Nathan call the police immediately, a notebook filled with addresses, dates, and detailed observations about families in the neighborhood. The Bradshaw's address was there, along with notes about their schedule, their kids' names, my name, what time I usually arrived and left. But here's what still keeps me up at night. Their entry was from 2016, but the newest entries were from just weeks before Nathan found it. Someone had been using that same mask, that same method, still watching families, still taking notes. The police took everything as evidence, but they never found who buried it there. Nathan sold that house within a month, didn't even wait to get his asking price. Neither of us talks about it anymore, but every Halloween, we text each other just to check in, just to make sure we're both okay, both safe, both nowhere near any windows where someone might be walking slow circles outside, recording everything, waiting for the right moment to test a basement door. Halloween 2022 changed everything for me. I was a senior at the State University, majoring in journalism, and I'd been covering campus stories for the student paper since freshman year. That October night started like any other Halloween weekend. Costume parties everywhere, drunk students stumbling around downtown, the usual chaos. I wasn't even supposed to be working that night, but our regular photographer, Kevin, had called in sick at the last minute. The editor asked if I could cover the big costume party at the Vault, this converted bank building that served as the hottest club near campus. I grabbed my camera, threw on a lazy vampire costume, just fangs and a cape over regular clothes, and headed downtown around 10 p.m. The streets were packed with zombies, witches, superheroes, everyone trying to outdo each other with their costumes. The party was exactly what you'd expect. Wall-to-wall people, terrible music, overpriced drinks. I spent about 2 hours taking photos of costume contest winners and drunk kids making fools of themselves. Around midnight, I noticed this guy in an incredibly detailed plague doctor mask. You know, those bird-like masks with the long beaks that medieval doctors wore during the Black Death. But this wasn't some cheap Halloween store version. The leather looked aged and authentic, with brass fixtures and glass eyepieces that reflected the strobe lights in this unsettling way. He was tall, maybe 6'2", wearing a long black coat that seemed way too heavy for the warm October weather we were having. What really caught my attention was how he moved through the crowd. People seemed to unconsciously step aside when he walked by, creating this bubble of space around him that felt wrong in such a packed venue. I raised my camera to get a shot of the costume, but when I looked through the viewfinder, he was staring directly at me through those glass lenses. I lowered the camera and he was gone, just vanished into the crowd like smoke. That should have been my first warning, but I brushed it off. People move fast in clubs, especially when they're drunk. I kept shooting photos for another hour until I ran into my roommate Jordan, who was dressed as some anime character I didn't recognize. He was completely wasted, barely able to stand, and his girlfriend Melissa was trying to convince him to leave. She asked if I could help her get him back to our apartment since it was on my way home anyway. We basically carried Jordan out of the club around 1:30 a.m., each of us supporting one of his arms while he mumbled about wanting pizza. The downtown area was still buzzing with people, but as we turned onto Riverside Avenue, the crowds thinned out. That's when I saw the plague doctor again, standing under a streetlight about a block ahead of us, perfectly still, facing our direction. Melissa noticed him too and made some joke about creepy dudes on Halloween, but something about the way he stood there made my chest tighten. We turned down Crawford Street to avoid walking past him. It was a shortcut anyway, cutting through this older part of downtown where they hadn't updated the streetlights yet. The street was darker than usual because several lights were out, and the shadows from the working ones created these long, distorted shapes on the pavement. Jordan had gone quiet, his head lolling forward as we dragged him along. About halfway down the block, Melissa's phone rang, her sister calling to make sure she got home safe. She let go of Jordan to answer, and I had to grab him with both arms to keep him from falling. That's when I heard footsteps behind us, slow and deliberate, the sound of heavy boots on concrete. I turned around and saw that plague doctor mask again, maybe 30 feet back, just walking steadily in our direction. I told Melissa we needed to move faster, but she was still on the phone, not paying attention. Jordan chose that exact moment to throw up all over his anime costume and my shoes, the smell of cheap beer and whatever he'd eaten hitting me instantly. While I was trying to keep him upright and not gag myself, Melissa finally hung up and started freaking out about Jordan's condition. We needed to stop and let him catch his breath, so we propped him against a brick wall next to this abandoned print shop that had been closed for years. The windows were boarded up with plywood that had graffiti tags I recognized from around campus. I kept glancing back, but the plague doctor had stopped too, maintaining that same 30-foot distance, just standing there in the middle of the sidewalk. The weird part was how patient he seemed, not approaching, not leaving, just waiting. Under the broken streetlight, I could barely make out his silhouette, but those glass eyepieces somehow caught what little light there was, creating 2 pinpoints of reflection that never moved away from us. Melissa was digging through her purse for tissues to clean Jordan up when we heard voices coming from the other end of Crawford Street. A group of people laughing and singing, probably heading home from another party. Relief washed through me because witnesses meant safety, right? But as the group got closer, I realized they were all wearing masks too. A wolf, a Jason hockey mask, something that looked like melted flesh, and another plague doctor mask, though cheaper looking than the one following us. They walked past us without acknowledging we were there, even though Jordan was actively dry heaving against the wall, and Melissa was practically yelling at him to drink some water. The group just flowed around us like we were invisible, their laughter continuing uninterrupted. When I looked back again, our plague doctor had moved closer, maybe 15 feet now, and 2 more figures had joined him, both in different but equally elaborate masks. One looked like a Victorian porcelain doll face. The other was some kind of demon with curved horns. That's when panic really set in. I grabbed Jordan under his arms and basically started dragging him forward while Melissa kept asking what was wrong. I couldn't form words to explain that 3 people in masks were following us and getting closer with each passing second. We stumbled forward, Jordan's feet barely helping, his weight making every step a struggle. The end of Crawford Street opened onto Washington Boulevard, where there should have been traffic, more people, safety. But when we reached the intersection, the usually busy boulevard was completely empty. No cars, no pedestrians, no sound except our own ragged breathing and Jordan's incoherent mumbling. The traffic lights were still changing from green to yellow to red, illuminating the empty asphalt in shifting colors, but there was nothing to direct. I could hear those footsteps getting closer, multiple sets now, no longer trying to match our pace but gaining on us. Melissa finally turned around and saw them. Her scream cut through the silence like breaking glass. We ran, or tried to run with Jordan barely conscious between us. We made it maybe half a block down Washington before Jordan's legs completely gave out and we had to stop. The masked figures had spread out behind us, no longer walking in a group but forming a semicircle that was slowly closing in. That's when I noticed others stepping out from doorways and alleys ahead of us. More masks, different styles but all elaborate and disturbing. A cracked baby doll face with one eye missing, a leather mask with zippers for features, something that looked like exposed muscle and sinew. They moved with this horrible synchronization, like they'd rehearsed this exact scenario. Melissa was crying, begging them to leave us alone, offering money, her phone, anything. But they never spoke, never made any sound except their footsteps. The original plague doctor raised one gloved hand and pointed at Jordan, then made a beckoning motion with his fingers. The message was clear. They wanted him. I don't know what made me do it, but I pulled out my phone and started recording video, thinking maybe evidence would help later, maybe someone would believe us. Through the screen, I saw something that made my knees weak. Jordan wasn't Jordan anymore. Where my roommate's face should have been, there was a blank, smooth surface, like skin stretched over where features should be. No eyes, no mouth, no nose, just flesh-colored nothing. Melissa saw my phone screen and looked down at what we were holding between us. Her scream this time was different, raw terror mixed with confusion. But when I looked directly at Jordan without the phone, his face was normal again, drunk and pale, but definitely there. I lifted the phone back up, and through the camera, that horrible blank face returned. The masked figures had stopped moving, apparently waiting for us to understand something. I switched to the front-facing camera and nearly dropped the phone. Melissa and I looked normal, but behind us, the street wasn't Crawford anymore. Through the phone screen, we were standing in some kind of warehouse or factory, with rusted metal walls and industrial equipment I couldn't identify. The plague doctor tilted his head, almost like he was amused, then reached up and removed his mask. Underneath was just a normal guy, maybe late 20s, with stubble and tired eyes. One by one, the others removed their masks too. Regular people, different ages, different ethnicities, but all with this exhausted, resigned expression. The man who'd worn the plague doctor mask spoke for the first time, his voice rough like he hadn't used it in a while. "He's already gone. Has been since you left the club. What you're carrying is just an echo, and it's drawing them here. Every Halloween, they send out echoes wearing faces, looking for specific people. You can keep dragging that thing around, but it's not your friend anymore." He pulled out an old flip phone, checked the time, and continued. "In about 3 minutes, that echo is going to walk back to where it came from, and if you're still holding on to it when it does, you'll go too. We've been trying to warn people for years, but the masks are the only way we can see each other, the only way we can move through the spaces where the echoes hunt." Melissa was sobbing, saying this was insane, that Jordan was right there. We could see him. But I believed the man because something deep in my gut had been screaming wrongness since we'd left the club. The plague doctor man tossed me a rubber Halloween mask, a cheap werewolf one from a dollar store. "Put it on and look at your friend again," he said. "Then decide if you want to let go." With shaking fingers, I pulled the mask over my head. Through the eye holes, Jordan wasn't there at all. Just a column of static, like television snow in human shape, and where his feet should have touched the ground, there was nothing, just empty space. Worse, I could see thin, translucent threads extending from the static thing into both Melissa and me, wrapped around our wrists like fishing line. The masked people weren't people anymore either. Through the werewolf mask, they looked like burn victims, with melted, scarred skin and missing pieces, but their eyes were kind, desperate even. 60 seconds, the man said, his voice distorted now through my mask-filtered perception. "Drop it and run. Don't look back, don't go home tonight, and whatever you do, don't answer if someone calls your name." Melissa and I let go of Jordan at the same time. The moment we did, the static thing stood perfectly upright on its own, turned and began walking back toward Crawford Street with mechanical precision. We ran in the opposite direction, our feet slapping against wet pavement I didn't remember being wet before. Behind us, I heard the masked people scattering, their footsteps fading in different directions. We ran for blocks until we reached the 24-hour diner on Peachtree. Bright lights and normal people everywhere. Melissa collapsed in a booth, hyperventilating, while I called 911 to report Jordan missing. The police found him 3 hours later, wandering downtown in his ruined costume with no memory of anything after midnight. He was fine, completely fine, except for one thing. He swore he'd been at his parents' house in Ohio the whole time, that he'd never even come back to campus after fall break. Security footage from the vault showed him at the party, but every camera that should have caught him on Crawford Street just showed static from 1:47 to 1:50 a.m. The really screwed up part? When I developed the photos from my camera the next day, every shot I'd taken of the plague doctor at the club showed a different person's face in that mask. And in the background of each one, there was always someone in a regular Halloween mask watching. I'd been counting down the days until I could leave my hometown since junior year of high school, and finally making it to State University felt like stepping into a whole different world. I'd been there for about 2 months when Halloween rolled around, and I was still that awkward freshman who ate most of her meals alone in the dining hall. My roommate had gone home for the weekend, leaving me with nothing but a pile of homework and a bag of fun-sized Snickers I'd bought for myself. I was sitting in the library that afternoon, October 31st, trying to focus on my psychology textbook when these three girls from my English Lit class approached my table. We'd done a group project together a few weeks earlier, but I wouldn't say we were friends, just the kind of acquaintances who smile and wave when you pass each other on campus. The one who did most of the talking was Ashley, this bubbly blonde who always wore designer everything, and somehow managed to look put together even at 8 in the morning. She leaned against my table and asked if I had plans for tonight, and when I said no, her face lit up like she'd just won something. They were going to this exclusive Halloween party at a house off campus, she explained, and the host specifically asked them to bring more people because a bunch of guests had canceled last minute. The other two girls, whose names I'm pretty sure were Chloe and Madison, but I honestly couldn't remember for certain, stood behind her nodding and smiling. Ashley showed me the address on her phone, 47882 Garrison Road, about 15 minutes from campus, and said to be there at 9, costume optional since it was such short notice. I remember feeling this little spark of excitement, thinking maybe this was finally my chance to break into the social scene I'd been watching from the sidelines. Around 4 that afternoon, I was walking from the library to my dorm when I noticed this guy behind me. He had on a gray hoodie with the hood up, dark jeans, and these beat-up red Converse that made this weird squeaking sound every few steps. At first I didn't think much of it. Campus was always crowded. But then I took a detour through the student union to grab a coffee, and when I came out 20 minutes later, there he was again, maybe 30 feet behind me. Same squeaky shoes, same hunched way of walking, like he was trying to make himself smaller. I ducked into the campus bookstore and pretended to browse the school spirit section for a good 10 minutes, watching the entrance through the corner of my eye. He never came in, and when I finally left, I didn't see him anywhere. I convinced myself I was being paranoid, that it was just some student who happened to be going the same direction. I spent way too long getting ready that night, changing outfits 3 times before settling on black jeans and this vintage band tee I'd found at a thrift store, figuring it was casual enough not to look like I was trying too hard but still appropriate for a party. The Uber driver had trouble finding the address at first, driving up and down Garrison Road twice before finally spotting the house numbers hidden behind an overgrown hedge. The house itself was one of those modern rental places that looked like it belonged in a magazine, all glass and sharp angles, with those automatic lights that turn on when you walk up the driveway. Music was thumping from inside, but something seemed weird about the windows. They all had these heavy blackout curtains drawn tight, not a single gap to see inside. Ashley's white BMW was parked out front though, or at least I thought it was hers. Same model, same sorority sticker on the back windshield. So I paid the driver and headed up to the front door. The door opened before I could even knock, and there was Madison wearing cat ears and holding a red Solo cup, giving me this huge smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. The music was louder inside, but not party loud. More like someone had just turned on a playlist to fill the silence, and the living room only had maybe 12 people scattered around, not the packed party I'd been expecting. Ashley waved from across the room where she was talking to some guy I didn't recognize, and Chloe was nowhere to be seen. The house had that sterile feel of a rental. Generic artwork on the walls, no family photos, that kind of aggressively neutral furniture that's meant to offend nobody and ends up feeling like nobody lives there at all. Madison handed me a drink without asking what I wanted, something pink and way too sweet that burned going down, and started introducing me to people whose names immediately slipped out of my head because I was too busy trying to figure out why everyone seemed to be watching me without actually looking directly at me. That's when I saw him in the kitchen, leaning against the counter and peeling the label off a beer bottle with his thumbnail. The guy from earlier, still in the same gray hoodie, those red Converse visible even from across the room. My whole body went rigid, and I must have made some kind of noise because Madison grabbed my arm and asked if I was okay, her fingers pressing harder than necessary into my skin. I tried to casually ask who he was, and she got this confused look and said his name was Brandon. Ashley's cousin from out of town who'd crashed the party last minute. But here's the thing. When I'd done that group project with Ashley, she'd spent half the time complaining about being an only child with no cousins, no extended family at all, just her and her divorced parents. I excused myself to find the bathroom, needing a minute to think, and Madison pointed down a hallway, saying it was the last door on the right, still gripping my arm like she didn't want to let go. The hallway was darker than it should have been, with only one dim bulb at the far end, and I passed 3 closed doors before reaching the bathroom. Inside, I locked the door and immediately tried calling my roommate, but my phone had no signal, not even one bar, which made no sense because we were still in the city. I tried connecting to Wi-Fi, but the only network that showed up was password protected with a name that was just random numbers and letters. My heart was hammering so hard I could hear it in my ears, and when I splashed cold water on my face, I noticed my reflection looked wrong in the mirror. It was one of those two-way mirrors, the kind where the reflection seems slightly darker, slightly off. I pressed my face close to the glass, cupping my hands around my eyes, and I swear I could see the faint outline of a room on the other side. That's when I heard footsteps stop right outside the bathroom door, and someone tried the handle, jiggling it when they found it locked. "Everything okay in there?" It was a man's voice I didn't recognize. Definitely not Brandon's, because I'd heard him talking to someone when I'd walked past the kitchen. The handle jiggled again, more insistent this time, and then I heard keys jingling. Keys. Why would someone have keys to the bathroom at a party? I looked around frantically for another exit, but there was just a tiny window above the shower, barely big enough for a cat to squeeze through. "Just a minute," I called out, trying to keep my voice steady while I opened the bathroom cabinet, searching for anything I could use as a weapon. Nothing but toilet paper and cleaning supplies. The key sound stopped, followed by whispering I couldn't make out, and then footsteps walking away. I waited another full minute before cracking the door open, and the hallway was empty, but now all 3 of those previously closed doors were standing wide open, revealing dark rooms that seemed to be watching me. I knew I had to get out of that house immediately. But when I walked back toward the living room, the layout seemed different somehow. The hallway felt longer, and there was a turn I didn't remember taking before. The music had stopped completely, replaced by this low murmur of voices that sounded rehearsed, like people reading from a script. When I finally reached the living room, everyone had rearranged themselves. They were all sitting now, facing the front door in these neat little rows like they were waiting for something. Ashley stood up when she saw me, that same bright smile plastered on her face, and announced to the room that I was ready. Ready for what? I tried to head for the door, but 2 guys I hadn't noticed before stepped in front of it, both of them bigger than football players, just standing there with their arms crossed. Brandon had moved from the kitchen and was now sitting on the arm of a couch, those red sneakers tapping against the floor in this rhythm that made my teeth hurt. "Your Uber already left," Ashley said, walking toward me with her phone in her hand, showing me the app like that proved something. "But don't worry, we've arranged another ride for you." That's when I noticed everyone else had their phones out too, all of them pointed at me, recording. The little red lights on their screens looked like eyes in the dim room, and I realized with absolute clarity that whatever they had planned, they wanted it documented. I backed up until I hit the wall, my mind racing through options. The back door, but I could see through to the kitchen where 3 more people were standing guard. The windows, but those blackout curtains were probably there for a reason, and even if I could get through one, I had no idea what was on the other side. Madison and Chloe flanked Ashley now, all 3 of them moving closer in this synchronized way that made them look like hunters who'd done this before. "We've been watching you for weeks," Ashley said, her voice different now, emptied of that fake sweetness. "You walk the same routes, eat at the same places, sit in the same spot in the library. You made it so easy." That's when I did the only thing I could think of. I grabbed the lamp from the side table next to me, this heavy ceramic thing shaped like a pineapple, and hurled it straight through the front window. The glass exploded outward with this incredible crash that seemed to snap everyone out of their choreographed movements for just a second, and in that second, I ran. Not toward the window I'd just broken, they'd expect that, but straight at the two guys blocking the door, screaming at the top of my lungs this primal sound I didn't know I could make. They hesitated, probably not expecting the quiet library girl to charge them like a linebacker, and I dropped down at the last second, sliding between them on the polished floor. My knee hit the door hard, but adrenaline is a hell of a drug, and I was up and fumbling with the deadbolt before they could grab me. The door flew open and I burst out into the night, still screaming, and that's what saved me, the neighbors. Turns out the house next door was having their own Halloween party. A real one, with 40 or 50 people who came pouring out when they heard the window break and me screaming like I was being murdered. Brandon tried to follow me out, but stopped dead when he saw all those people streaming across the lawn, some of them already on their phones calling 911. I collapsed on the neighbor's driveway, sobbing and trying to explain what had happened, but I didn't need to convince them. They could see Ashley and her group standing in the doorway of the house, all of them still holding their phones, looking like kids caught doing something terrible. The police showed up within minutes, and that's when everything unraveled fast. Turns out the house was an Airbnb rented with a stolen credit card. Ashley and the other two girls weren't even students at State University, and Brandon, his real name was Colin, had a record for assault and was violating parole just by being in the state. They found cameras hidden throughout the house, streaming to some website I don't even want to know about. The whole thing was apparently part of some sick streaming game, where people pay to watch staged scenarios with unsuspecting victims. The police said I was lucky. 2 other girls from different colleges had reported similar setups that month, but they hadn't been able to prove anything because the perpetrators always cleaned up and disappeared. This time, they'd gotten sloppy, too confident. They're all in prison now, and I had to testify at the trial, which was its own kind of nightmare. But at least it's over. I finished my freshman year, though I changed dorms and vary my routes everywhere I go now. I still can't hear squeaky shoes without feeling sick, and I definitely don't accept party invitations from anyone I don't know well. But I survived, and that's what matters. Sometimes that's all you can do, survive and make sure the bastards don't get to do it to anyone else. Halloween night 2018 will permanently live in my brain as the night I realized how vulnerable we really are in our own homes. I was 27 at the time, living with my girlfriend Vanessa in a small 2-bedroom rental house in Springfield, Massachusetts. We'd been together for about 3 years, and life was pretty normal. I worked as an insurance adjuster, she was a dental hygienist, and we had this comfortable routine where we'd cook dinner together most nights and watch terrible reality TV shows until we passed out on the couch. The house itself wasn't anything special, just one of those cookie-cutter builds from the 70s with thin walls and creaky floors, but it was ours for the time being. That Halloween fell on a Wednesday, and Vanessa had been excited about this new Italian place that opened downtown, so we'd made reservations weeks in advance. I remember she wore this deep purple dress that she'd been saving for a special occasion, and I'd actually ironed a button-down shirt for once, which she'd joked about all evening. We left around 6:30, right when the trick-or-treaters were starting to come around, and I'd left our porch light off since we wouldn't be home to hand out candy anyway. Dinner was fantastic. We're talking homemade pasta, wine that was probably too expensive for our budget, and this tiramisu that Vanessa kept saying she wanted to recreate at home. The restaurant had this cozy, dimly lit atmosphere, with fake cobwebs hung up for the holiday, and our waiter was wearing vampire fangs that kept slipping when he talked, which made us laugh every time he came to our table. We stayed longer than we'd planned, probably until around 9:30 or so, just enjoying each other's company without our phones or the TV as a distraction. The drive home took about 15 minutes, and I remember the streets were pretty much empty by then. Most of the kids had gone home, and the neighborhood had that eerie post-Halloween quiet where you could see decorations swaying in people's yards but no actual people anywhere. When we pulled into our driveway, I noticed our next-door neighbor's house was completely dark, which was unusual because old Mr. Brennan usually stayed up late watching his police procedurals with the volume way too loud. Vanessa was humming some song from the restaurant's playlist as we walked up to our front door, and I was fishing for my keys in my jacket pocket, thinking about how I was definitely going to need to take some antacids before bed because of all that rich food. The first thing that hit me when I opened the door was this weird smell. Not terrible, but distinct, like someone had been eating cheap chocolate and those sour gummy candies that kids go crazy for. I stepped inside and flicked on the living room light, and that's when my brain started trying to make sense of what I was seeing. There were candy wrappers everywhere, and I mean everywhere. Snickers wrappers on the coffee table, empty Kit Kat packages on the couch, those little fun-size Milky Way wrappers scattered across our area rug like confetti. My first thought was that maybe we'd left a window open and some bold raccoon had gotten in because we'd had issues with them getting into our trash before. But then I noticed our back door, the one that leads to our tiny excuse for a backyard, was open about 6 inches. Not wide open, not broken or forced, just open, like someone had stepped out for a second and forgotten to close it all the way. Vanessa came in behind me and immediately grabbed my arm, her fingernails digging into my jacket sleeve. "What the hell?" she whispered, and I could hear her voice shaking a little. I told her to stay by the front door while I checked it out, trying to sound way more confident than I actually felt. I walked through the living room carefully, stepping over the wrappers and trying to listen for any sounds. Our house was old enough that you couldn't walk anywhere without the floors announcing your presence, so I was making these soft creaking noises with every step, which made it even harder to hear anything else. The back door was definitely unlocked. I could see the deadbolt was turned to the open position, which meant someone had unlocked it from the inside, not forced it. That detail stuck with me because I'm obsessive about locking doors, always have been, and I know for a fact I'd checked that door before we left. I pushed it open wider with my foot and looked out into the backyard, but it was just darkness and the vague shapes of our pathetic attempt at a garden that had mostly died by September. The motion sensor light we'd installed last spring should have been on, but it wasn't, and I realized someone must have unscrewed the bulb because I could see it was missing from the socket. That's when the situation started feeling a lot less like dumb kids pulled a prank and a lot more like someone planned this. I came back inside and locked the door, sliding the deadbolt as quietly as I could. And that's when I saw the light coming from under the guest room door down the hallway. We never used that room. It was basically storage. Boxes of Vanessa's college textbooks, my old golf clubs that I kept pretending I'd use again, winter clothes in plastic bins, that kind of stuff. The light in there was one of those weak overhead fixtures with a pull chain, and we never turned it on because there was no reason to. I felt this wave of adrenaline hit me, the kind that makes your hearing go sharp and your muscles tense up like you're about to sprint or fight. I motioned for Vanessa to stay back, and I grabbed this heavy Maglite flashlight we kept by the back door. Not because I needed light, but because it was the closest thing to a weapon I had within reach. As I got closer to that door, maybe 10 feet away, I heard it. Breathing. Not heavy, not labored, just the quiet, rhythmic sound of someone trying very hard to stay still and silent. It was coming from inside that room, and whoever it was wasn't doing a great job of staying quiet, because I could hear this faint whistling sound on the exhale, like their nose was stuffy or they'd been running. My brain was racing through possibilities. Maybe it was a kid who'd gotten scared and was hiding. Maybe it was some homeless person who'd found a way in and was just trying to survive the cold night. Maybe it was someone high on drugs who didn't even know where they were. But then I heard a small mechanical sound, like a phone vibrating on silent mode, and the breathing stopped completely. Whoever was in there had just gotten a message or notification, and they were now aware that we were home, and probably knew we'd heard them. The silence that followed was worse than the breathing, because it meant they were listening for us, just as intently as we were listening for them. Vanessa had moved closer despite my warning, and she was standing maybe 5 feet behind me, her phone already open to the 911 screen, with her thumb hovering over the call button. I could see her face in the glow of her screen. She was pale, her jaw clenched, eyes wide but focused. I remember thinking how crazy it was that we were standing in our own hallway, in our own house, afraid of a door we opened and closed 100 times before. I raised my voice, trying to sound authoritative, but hearing it come out shakier than I wanted, and said something like, "We've already called the police, they're on their way, you need to come out now." Complete bluff, obviously, but I didn't know what else to do. For maybe 10 seconds, nothing happened. Then I heard movement. Not toward the door, but away from it, like shuffling footsteps moving toward the window on the far side of the room. That window. I knew that window didn't open easily because the frame had warped over time, and we'd never bothered to fix it since we didn't use that room anyway, which meant whoever was in there had probably come in through the back door, not the window, and was now trapped unless they wanted to confront us directly. I heard them struggling with the window, the scraping sound of wood against wood as they tried to force it up. Vanessa whispered urgently behind me, "Call them, actually call them right now," and I heard her fingers tapping on her screen. She spoke in this low, controlled voice to the dispatcher, giving our address and saying there was an intruder in our home. Still inside, we could hear them. The dispatcher told her to get out of the house immediately. Don't engage. Wait outside for the officers. But Vanessa just said, "Okay," and didn't move an inch. We both stood there, frozen in this awful moment of decision. Do we run outside and risk them getting away, or do we stay and potentially trap them until the cops arrive? The window finally gave way with this loud crack, and I heard it slide up. I made a split-second choice and rushed to the door, throwing it open and hitting the light switch, flooding the room with that harsh overhead light. What I saw has been burned into my memory ever since. It was a man, probably mid-30s, wearing a stained gray hoodie and jeans that were too big for him, one leg already out the window. He turned and looked directly at me, and his face, God, his face was just so ordinary. Brown hair, patchy stubble, dark circles under his eyes like he hadn't slept in days. He wasn't some masked monster or deranged lunatic. He just looked tired and desperate and caught. Our eyes met for maybe 2 seconds, but it felt longer. And in that moment, I saw something that genuinely unnerved me more than if he'd been aggressive. He looked disappointed, like a kid who'd been caught doing something they knew was wrong. There were more candy wrappers around his feet, and I noticed he'd been sitting in our desk chair, which he'd pulled over to face the door, like he'd been waiting there, eating Halloween candy and just listening to us on the other side. He had a backpack next to the chair, unzipped, and I could see what looked like Vanessa's jewelry box inside, along with my laptop that I'd left on the desk in our bedroom. He didn't say anything, just stared at me for another second, then pulled his other leg through the window and dropped down into our backyard. I heard the thud of him landing, then the sound of him scrambling over our chain-link fence into the alley behind our house. I ran to the window and looked out, but he was already gone, swallowed up by the darkness between houses. My whole body was shaking, not from fear exactly, but from this cocktail of adrenaline and anger and this bizarre relief that he was gone and hadn't hurt us. Vanessa appeared in the doorway, still on the phone with the dispatcher, and she looked into the room and saw the chair positioned like that, facing the door, and I watched her face change. She got it immediately, understood what I'd just understood. He'd been sitting there listening to us, maybe for minutes before we even knew he was there. Maybe he'd heard us come in, heard us talking in the living room, and just sat there in the dark deciding what to do. That thought made me feel violated in a way that the stolen stuff didn't. The police showed up maybe 6 minutes later, which felt like an eternity, but was apparently pretty fast for our area. 2 officers, one older guy who looked like he'd seen everything, and a younger woman who actually seemed really engaged with what we were telling them. They checked the whole house room by room, looked at the window he'd escaped through, examined the back door and the missing light bulb. The older cop, Officer Dennings, told us it was likely someone who'd been watching the house, knew we'd gone out for the evening, and had probably been inside for at least an hour or more based on the amount of candy wrappers. He pointed out that the guy had eaten maybe 20 or 30 pieces, which takes time, and he'd clearly gone through our bedroom since he had my laptop. The younger officer, her name tag said Alvarez, she's the one who asked the question that made everything click into place. How did he get in? Was the back door unlocked when you left? I told her no, absolutely not. I'm obsessive about locking up. She went back to examine the door more carefully with a flashlight, and when she came back, her expression was serious. There's no sign of forced entry, she said. No scratches on the lock, no damage to the frame. Whoever came in had a key. That statement hit me like a punch to the chest. A key. My mind immediately went to all the people who'd had access to our house. The landlord, obviously, and his maintenance guy who'd fixed our water heater last spring. We'd given a spare to Vanessa's sister for emergencies, but she lived 2 hours away, and we'd just seen her the previous weekend. I'd also lent our key to our friend Austin when we went on vacation in July, so he could water our plants and grab our mail, and he'd given it back, or at least I thought he had. Vanessa was going through the same mental checklist, and I could see panic building in her eyes. Officer Alvarez asked us to make a list of everyone who'd ever had a key, even temporarily, and to call our landlord to find out if anyone else had access to the spare keys he kept. The officers took photos of everything, bagged a few of the candy wrappers as evidence in case they caught the guy and needed to place him at the scene, and gave us a case number. Dennings told us bluntly that we needed to change our locks immediately, first thing tomorrow morning, and to seriously consider getting a security system. Before they left, Alvarez mentioned that there'd been a small uptick in break-ins in our neighborhood over the past month, all of them while residents were out. None of them violent, mostly just theft. But she said ours was the first one where the intruder was caught inside and the first where there was no forced entry. That made us special, lucky in the worst possible way. After they left, Vanessa and I didn't sleep that night. We pushed our dresser against the bedroom door, kept every light in the house on, and just sat up talking through every scenario we could think of. Around 3 in the morning, I remembered something that made my skin go cold. When we first moved in 2 years ago, our landlord had mentioned that the previous tenant had left suddenly, something about a bad breakup, and there'd been some confusion about whether all the keys had been returned. At the time, I hadn't thought much of it, but now it felt significant. The next morning, exhausted and paranoid, I called a locksmith before I even had coffee. The guy came out that same day and changed every single lock on the house. Front door, back door, even the side gate. Cost us almost $400, but I didn't care. We also called Vanessa's sister and Austin to verify they still had their keys or had returned them, and both confirmed they did. Austin even drove over that afternoon to physically show me the key, which I'd completely forgotten I'd gotten back from him, and had hung on our key rack. The landlord was harder to reach, but when I finally got him on the phone, he admitted he'd had 6 copies of the house key at one point, and couldn't account for where all of them were now. That was infuriating, but also oddly relieving. At least we had a likely explanation. We never found out who that guy was. The police never caught him, and honestly, I don't think they tried that hard. No one was hurt, nothing irreplaceable was taken since he dropped the backpack when he ran, and they had bigger cases to worry about. Vanessa and I ended up breaking our lease 3 months later and moving to an apartment complex with actual security, cameras in the hallways, the whole deal. We both agreed we couldn't stay in that house, not after knowing someone had sat in our guest room in the dark, eating candy and listening to us live our lives just on the other side of a door. The thing that still bothers me, even now, isn't the theft or even the danger we were potentially in. It's that image of the chair pulled up facing the door, all those wrappers around it, and the realization that he'd been there long enough to get comfortable. He wasn't in a hurry. He wasn't panicked. He was just waiting, and if we'd come home even 30 minutes earlier, or if he'd decided to walk out of that room instead of hiding, I don't know what would have happened. Sometimes I wonder if it really was just a random guy who'd gotten hold of an old key, or if it was the previous tenant who'd never really left us alone. Either way, I check every lock twice now, every single night, and I probably always will. Halloween used to be my favorite holiday. I'm talking full-on obsessed, planning costumes in August, mapping out the best candy routes, the whole deal. I was 14 in October 2015, living with my mom and younger brother in a suburb outside Portland, Oregon. Our street, Oakmont Drive, was one of those picture-perfect neighborhoods where people actually knew each other's names and borrowed lawn equipment. Every house went all out for Halloween. Carved pumpkins, fake cobwebs, those inflatable ghosts that looked ridiculous in daylight. Except for one house. Number 447, about 5 doors down from us. A single-story ranch with faded blue siding, belonging to a guy everyone just called Mr. Henley. He'd lived there longer than anyone could remember, kept to himself, never caused problems. But here's the weird part. Every single Halloween, without fail, he'd decorate his front porch. Not elaborate stuff, just a couple of carved pumpkins, some orange lights, a wreath on the door. Made it look like he was participating. But if you actually walked up those steps and knocked, nothing. Complete silence. The lights would be on inside, you could see the flicker of a TV through the curtains. But he never, ever answered the door. Most kids learned to skip his house after the first year of trying. It became this unspoken thing in the neighborhood. You'd see groups of trick-or-treaters walk right past 447 without even slowing down. But it always bugged me, you know? Why decorate if you're not going to hand out candy? Why make your house look inviting and then ignore everyone? My friend Troy, this scrawny kid with red hair who lived for causing trouble, had this theory that Mr. Henley was doing it on purpose, like some psychological experiment to mess with people. Troy's older brother Dylan was 17, had his license, and thought he was hot shit because he could grow a patchy beard. That October, Dylan decided he was going to teach the old creep a lesson for being antisocial. He recruited Troy, me, and this girl Amber from our grade who had a reputation for being fearless. The plan was simple, stupid teenager stuff. We'd go to Mr. Henley's house on Halloween night, TP his trees, maybe smash a pumpkin, ring the doorbell a bunch of times and run. Classic prank, nothing crazy. I remember feeling uneasy about it even then, but I didn't want to look like a coward in front of everyone, especially Amber. So I agreed. Halloween night came with that perfect autumn chill in the air. Our neighborhood was packed. Families everywhere, little kids in princess costumes holding their parents' hands, teenagers in lazy last-minute outfits. Dylan picked us up around 8:30 in his beat-up Jeep Cherokee, after most of the young trick-or-treaters had gone home. Troy was practically vibrating with excitement in the passenger seat, kept going on about how this was going to be legendary. Amber sat in the back with me, checking her phone, looking bored but game for whatever. We parked 2 streets over and walked, carrying rolls of toilet paper stuffed in our jacket pockets. The closer we got to Oakmont Drive, the quieter it became. Most porch lights were turning off, the Halloween energy dying down for the night. When we reached Mr. Henley's house, I noticed the decorations looked exactly the same as every other year. 2 jack-o'-lanterns on the porch steps, their triangle eyes glowing from the candles inside, orange string lights outlining the doorframe. His living room light was on, and through the sheer curtains, I could see the blue glow of his television. Everything looked normal, peaceful even. That's what made what Dylan said next feel so out of place. "Check it out," Dylan whispered, pointing to the roof edge above the porch. At first, I didn't see what he meant. Then Amber spotted it too. A small black object mounted under the eave, angled down toward the walkway. "Is that a camera?" she asked. We all stared at it for a second. It was definitely a camera, one of those compact security ones, and it was pointed directly at the sidewalk and front path. "Paranoid old bastard," Dylan muttered, but he was grinning like it made the whole thing more exciting. Troy suggested we do the prank from the side yard instead, away from the camera's view. We crept around to the right side of the house, where a tall wooden fence separated Mr. Henley's property from his neighbors. The area was darker here, just a small side window with the blinds drawn and a motion sensor light that thankfully didn't trigger. Dylan started unrolling toilet paper, getting ready to toss it over the fence into the front yard trees. That's when Troy noticed something that made him grab my arm hard enough to hurt. "Dude," he hissed, "there's another one." He was pointing at the corner of the house near the foundation. Another camera, smaller than the first, tucked into the shadow where the siding met the concrete. This one was aimed along the side of the house, covering the exact area where we were standing. My stomach twisted. Why would someone need cameras on the side of their house? Dylan tried to play it cool, said lots of people have security systems, but his voice had lost that cocky edge. Amber wanted to leave. She kept saying this was creepy and we should just go, but Troy, stubborn as always, said we'd come this far and weren't going to chicken out over some cameras. He started moving toward the back of the house, staying close to the wall, and like idiots, we followed. The backyard was small and enclosed by that same wooden fence, with a concrete patio and a rusted barbecue grill that looked like it hadn't been used in years. A sliding glass door led into what I assumed was the kitchen, and next to it was a regular door with a small window at the top. Everything was dark back there except for one thing. Mounted on the back corner of the house, pointed at the yard, was a third camera, and this one had a little red light blinking on it. Troy saw it the same time I did. Nobody said anything for a moment. We just stood there in this guy's backyard, realizing that every single angle of his property was being recorded. That's when Dylan, trying to salvage his tough guy image, did the dumbest thing possible. He walked right up to the back door and knocked. Loud. The sound echoed in the quiet night. We all tensed up, waiting for Mr. Henley to flip on the porch light or yell at us to get lost. But nothing happened. Dylan knocked again, harder this time, the kind of aggressive banging that would wake up anyone inside. Still nothing. "He's definitely home," Amber whispered, pointing at the TV light still visible through the front windows. We could even hear it faintly, the muffled sound of voices from whatever show was playing. Dylan tried the door handle, locked, obviously. Then he cupped his hands around his face and peered through the small window at the top of the door. He went completely still. "What?" Troy asked. "What do you see?" Dylan didn't answer right away. When he finally stepped back, his face looked pale even in the darkness. "There's papers," he said quietly. "Like, everywhere, covering the walls." Before anyone could process that, Troy shoved past him and looked through the window himself. "Holy shit," he breathed. "It's all printouts. Photos, I think." I didn't want to look. Every instinct was screaming at me to get out of there, to go home, forget this whole stupid night. But curiosity is a terrible thing. I stepped up and pressed my face to the cold glass. The kitchen was dim, lit only by the glow spilling in from another room, but I could see enough. The walls were absolutely plastered with printed photographs, hundreds of them, maybe thousands, overlapping each other like scales on a fish. They covered every visible surface, taped up in this obsessive collage that made my brain hurt to look at. From what I could make out, they were pictures of the street. Our street, different times of day, different seasons. I recognized Mrs. Palmer's garden from last spring, the Johnsons' car that they'd sold months ago, and people. Kids walking to the bus stop, parents pushing strollers, teenagers on bikes, all taken from a distance like surveillance photos. My eyes landed on one image that was closer than the others, clearer. It showed 3 kids in Halloween costumes from what looked like last year, a vampire, a witch, and a skeleton. They were walking right past Mr. Henley's house, probably on their way to better candy spots. The photo was zoomed in enough that you could see their faces clearly. I recognized the vampire. It was Troy's little sister, Kayla. She'd been 9 last Halloween. "We need to call the cops," Amber said, and her voice was shaking now. She had her phone out already. But before she could dial, we heard it. A sound from inside the house. Not footsteps exactly, more like something being dragged across the floor. Heavy and slow. We all backed away from the door at the same time. Troy grabbed Dylan's arm and started pulling him toward the side of the house, toward the way we'd come in. That's when I noticed Dylan was staring at something. "Where's Troy?" he said. It took a second for the words to make sense. I turned around. Troy was right there next to Dylan. He'd just been pulling on his arm. But Dylan wasn't looking at Troy. He was looking past us, at the back fence. "Not Troy," Dylan said, his voice weird and flat. "The other kid. the one who was just standing by the grill. Ice flooded my veins. There had been 4 of us, me, Dylan, Troy, and Amber. Nobody else. "What are you talking about?" Amber demanded. But she was looking around now too, her phone's flashlight swinging wildly. Dylan insisted he'd seen someone, a shorter figure in dark clothes, standing by the barbecue grill when we were all looking through the window. He'd assumed it was one of us who'd wandered off. We tore out of that backyard like our lives depended on it. I slammed my shin against the corner of the fence gate so hard I saw stars, but I didn't stop running. We didn't stop until we reached Dylan's Jeep 2 streets away, all of us gasping for air, checking and rechecking that it was just the 4 of us. Dylan kept insisting he'd seen someone, describing a person maybe 5 feet tall, wearing a dark hoodie. Troy called him paranoid, said it was just shadows and he'd freaked himself out. But I'd seen Dylan's face in that moment. He wasn't the type to scare easy, and he'd looked genuinely confused, like his brain couldn't make sense of what his eyes had seen. We sat in the Jeep for almost 20 minutes arguing about what to do. Amber wanted to call the police immediately and tell them about the cameras and the photos. Troy was worried we'd get in trouble for trespassing. Dylan had gone quiet, just gripping the steering wheel and staring out the windshield. Finally, I convinced them we should at least tell our parents. Let them handle it like adults. We agreed to go home, and tomorrow we'd figure out the right way to report what we'd seen. Dylan dropped everyone off. When I got home, my mom was watching TV in the living room. I almost told her everything right then, but the words stuck in my throat. How do you explain that you were trying to vandalize someone's house and discovered something way worse? I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those photos layered on top of each other, all those unsuspecting people going about their lives while being documented. The next morning, a Wednesday, my mom woke me up early. Her face was serious in a way that made my chest tighten. "Did you see Troy last night?" she asked. I told her, yeah, we'd all hung out for Halloween. She sat down on my bed and took a breath. "His mom just called. He never came home last night." The room started spinning. I told her that couldn't be right. Dylan had dropped Troy off at his house around 10:30, same as the rest of us. My mom said Troy's mom had been up waiting, and he never walked through the door. His phone was going straight to voicemail. They'd already called the police. I got dressed in a blur, and my mom drove me to Troy's house, where there were already 2 police cars parked outside. Troy's parents looked destroyed, his mom crying on the porch while his dad talked to the officers. They asked me questions. When did I last see him? Did he mention going anywhere else? Did he seem upset or different? I told them everything I could without mentioning where we'd actually been, said we were just walking around the neighborhood. One of the officers wrote everything down in a little notepad, his face professionally neutral, asking if Troy had any problems at home or school, the standard runaway questions. By that afternoon, I couldn't take it anymore. I called Amber and told her we needed to tell someone about Mr. Henley's house, about what we'd seen. She'd been thinking the same thing. We decided to tell her older sister, who was 22 and worked as a paralegal, someone who'd know how to handle it properly. When we explained everything to her, showing her exactly where the house was on Oakmont Drive, her expression turned grim. She didn't yell at us for trespassing. She just made us repeat every detail twice, then immediately called a detective hotline she had saved in her phone from her work. Within an hour, there were 6 police cars on our street. I watched from my bedroom window as officers surrounded Mr. Henley's house, knocking on the door with that official police knock. When he didn't answer, they went around back. I couldn't see what happened next, but within 30 minutes, they were bringing Mr. Henley out in handcuffs. He was smaller than I'd imagined, balding, wearing a cardigan that made him look like somebody's retired grandfather. He wasn't fighting or yelling. He just looked resigned, like he'd been expecting this day to come eventually. More police showed up. They started carrying boxes out of the house. Computer equipment, hard drives, file folders. The whole street came out to watch. Nobody could believe it. Mr. Henley, the quiet neighbor who kept to himself, was being arrested right in front of everyone. The full story came out over the next few days, pieced together from news reports and neighborhood gossip. Police found over 30 cameras hidden around Mr. Henley's property and inside his house, all pointed at the street and sidewalks. His computer contained thousands upon thousands of photos and videos of children from the neighborhood, organized into folders by name, age, and physical description. He'd been doing this for at least 8 years, maybe longer. The cameras had motion sensors. They'd activate whenever someone walked by. He had footage of kids waiting for the school bus, playing in yards, riding bikes. Nothing explicitly illegal in terms of the footage itself, since it was all taken from his property of public spaces. But the scope and obsessive nature of the collection was enough for charges related to stalking and endangering minors. They found detailed notes about routines, favorite colors, names of friends. It was a surveillance operation that would have made intelligence agencies jealous. But here's the thing that still haunts me. They found Troy. Not at Mr. Henley's house, and that's what made it so much worse in a way. Troy had apparently panicked after Dylan dropped him off. Couldn't stop thinking about those photos and that figure Dylan claimed to see. Instead of going inside his house, he'd walked back to Oakmont Drive by himself, planning to watch Mr. Henley's house from a distance to see if anything suspicious happened. A neighbor 2 doors down from Mr. Henley had a security camera, and it caught Troy standing across the street around 11 p.m. just watching the house. What the camera also caught, about 15 minutes later, was a van pulling up. Not Mr. Henley's vehicle, something else entirely. A white contractor van with no plates visible. 2 men got out. They walked straight toward Troy. The footage was grainy and taken from an angle, but you could see Troy backing away, then the men moving faster, and then Troy was just gone. The van drove off. Police traced the van through other neighborhood cameras and traffic footage. It led them to a house in Vancouver, Washington, about 20 miles away. What they found there was worse than anything at Mr. Henley's place. Turns out Mr. Henley wasn't working alone. He was part of a network, and his role was surveillance, identifying targets, documenting patterns, providing information to others who did the actual abductions. The house in Vancouver was where they brought the kids. I can't write the details of what happened in that place. I still have nightmares about what the news reports implied. They found Troy there, along with 2 other children who'd been missing from different counties. Troy had been there less than 24 hours when police raided the location. He was physically okay, traumatized beyond belief, but alive. The timing of our discovery and report had literally saved his life. If we'd waited even one more day to tell someone, the outcome would have been different. 7 people were arrested in total, including Mr. Henley. The trial was massive, made national news for a while. Mr. Henley took a plea deal and got 40 years. The others got more. Troy moved away with his family about 6 months later. Couldn't handle living on that street anymore, knowing that his every movement had been cataloged for years by someone living 5 houses down. I don't blame him. I moved away too for college and never went back except to visit my mom. She sold that house in 2023. Sometimes I think about how many times I walked past Mr. Henley's place as a kid, completely oblivious. How many times I was photographed, filed away, studied. The police said we were lucky that Mr. Henley's role was just observation, that he personally never hurt anyone, just enabled others to do so. But that doesn't make it better. He sat in that house for years, watching children, knowing exactly what his information would be used for. The decorations on Halloween were bait, a test to see which kids would come to his door, get close enough for clear facial shots. That's why he never answered. He didn't want candy-seeking trick-or-treaters. He wanted footage. The figure Dylan saw in the backyard that night? Police think it might have been one of Mr. Henley's associates, checking on something, maybe even watching us while we discovered the cameras. We'll never know for sure, and honestly, I don't want to know. What I do know is that Halloween will never feel the same. Every decorated house, every porch light, every neighbor I don't quite recognize, it all carries this weight now. Trust is a fragile thing. Sometimes the monsters don't hide in the shadows. Sometimes they live 5 doors down and wave politely when you check the mail. November 1st, 2023 started like any other morning after Halloween, except I couldn't stop thinking about what happened the night before. I'm 17, a senior at Lincoln High in Pennsylvania, and I'd been looking forward to having the house to myself for once. Mom and Dad had this wedding to go to in Philadelphia, some second cousin I'd never met, and they'd be gone until late. They kept asking if I wanted them to stay, if I'd be okay alone on Halloween night. But honestly, I was thrilled. No parents meant I could game with my buddies online, order whatever food I wanted, and not deal with handing out candy to screaming kids all night. I'd been working part-time at Best Buy after school, saving up for a car, and I was exhausted. A quiet night in sounded perfect. Our neighborhood in Harrisburg wasn't exactly the trick-or-treating capital anyway. Most families drove their kids to the newer developments where the houses were closer together. We lived on Belmont Road, where the properties had these long driveways and the houses sat far back from the street. Perfect for privacy, perfect for what I thought would be a peaceful evening. Around 7:30, just as it was getting dark, the first knock came. I was in the middle of a raid in Destiny 2, headset on, completely zoned into the game. The knock was loud enough that I heard it through my headphones, which annoyed me because I was about to take down a boss. I muted my mic and yelled, "We're not doing candy this year!" toward the front door, not even bothering to get up. My character died because I wasn't paying attention, and I cursed under my breath. The knocking came again, harder this time, more insistent. I pulled off my headset and actually listened. It was this weird rhythm, 3 quick knocks, pause, 2 slow ones. Not the usual excited kid knock. Something about it felt deliberate, almost like a code. I pushed back from my desk in the living room where I'd set up my gaming station and walked to the front hallway. Our house has this long entrance with the door at the end, and there's a small window beside it. But the porch light was off because, well, we weren't participating. Through the frosted glass panel, I could see shapes, 2, maybe 3 people standing there. They were wearing masks, looked like adults based on their height. I figured maybe older kids, high schoolers trying to score free candy. I didn't open the door. Instead, I called out through it, "Sorry, we're not handing out candy tonight." My voice came out stronger than I felt, trying to sound authoritative like my dad does when he wants solicitors to leave. There was this long pause, maybe 10 seconds of complete silence, and I thought they'd left. Then I heard it. A woman's voice, muffled through the door, sweet and friendly. "Oh, we're not trick-or-treating, honey. We're from the house across the street, the Buchanans. We're collecting donations for the community center's Halloween fund. Just a few dollars if you can spare it." I didn't know anyone named Buchanan, and I'd lived here my whole life. The house directly across from ours had been empty for 3 months since old Mr. Garrett died. His kids were still fighting over the estate or something. My mom had mentioned it. I stood there, hand on the doorknob, feeling this weird tension in my chest. The smart thing would have been to just say no thanks and walk away. But I felt rude, you know? Like maybe they were new neighbors I hadn't met yet, and I didn't want to be that jerk teenager who slammed the door on people trying to do something nice for the community. I don't really have any cash on me," I said through the door, which was true. I had maybe $6 in my wallet upstairs. "Maybe you could come back when my parents are home?" The woman's voice came again, and this time something about it sounded different, less friendly, more practiced, like she was reading from a script. "That's okay, sweetie. Do you have Venmo? We can do it digitally. Or we're also just passing out these flyers about the event. Could you just open the door real quick so I can hand you one?" Every instinct I had suddenly screamed no. My girlfriend Veronica, we'd been dating for 8 months. She was always joking about how I was too trusting, how I'd probably let a serial killer in if they asked politely enough. I remembered her saying that, and actually took a step back from the door. "You know what? I'm actually not supposed to open the door when my parents aren't home," I said, trying to keep my voice casual. "But thanks anyway." The silence that followed was heavy, uncomfortable. I could see the shapes through the frosted glass, and they weren't moving, just standing there. Then came that same knock pattern again, 3 quick, 2 slow, but harder this time, almost aggressive. The whole door shook with it. My heart started pounding in a way that made my ears ring. I backed up further into the hallway, putting more distance between me and that door. "I really can't help you tonight," I shouted, my voice cracking a bit on the last word. I hated how scared I sounded. Through the window, I watched the shapes finally move. They turned away from the door and I could see them walking down our porch steps. Relief flooded through me so fast I actually felt dizzy. See? Just persistent fundraisers or whatever. Annoying but harmless. I laughed at myself a little, feeling stupid for getting so worked up. I went back to my gaming setup, put my headset back on, and rejoined my buddies in the chat. "Dude, where'd you go?" my friend Carlos asked. "Had some weirdos at the door," I said, trying to sound casual about it. "Halloween brings out all the crazies." We played for another hour, and I'd mostly forgotten about the whole thing. Around 9 o'clock, I ordered a pizza, pepperoni and jalapeno, something Mom would never let me get because she says it's too greasy. I was paying online when I heard it again. That knock. 3 quick, 2 slow. I ripped off my headset so fast it clattered onto my desk. The knocking continued, patient and rhythmic, like whoever was out there had all the time in the world. This time I was angry more than scared. What part of no did these people not understand? I marched to the front door, ready to be way less polite, and looked through the peephole we had installed up high. 3 people stood on my porch, all wearing those cheap rubber masks you get at Spirit Halloween, a werewolf, a zombie, and what looked like a screaming ghost face. They were all facing the door, perfectly still, like they were posing for a photo. All 3 were definitely adults, broad shoulders, tall, wearing dark clothes that weren't costumes. Something about the way they stood there, not fidgeting or talking to each other, made my anger evaporate instantly. Normal people don't stand that still. "We're still collecting for the community center," the woman's voice came again, but this time she wasn't even trying to sound friendly. It was flat, almost bored. "We know you're alone in there. Your parents won't be back until late." My entire body went rigid. How did they know that? How did they know my parents were gone? I definitely hadn't told them that detail. I stepped away from the door as quietly as possible, my socks silent on the hardwood floor. My phone was still on my desk in the living room. I needed to call 911 or my parents or someone. But as I turned to head back, I heard something that made me stop breathing. Footsteps, not on the porch. These were moving around the side of the house. Deliberate, crunching through the leaves my dad had been too lazy to rake last weekend. They were circling the house. I crept toward the living room window that faced our driveway and carefully pulled back just the edge of the curtain. The werewolf mask was peering into my dad's office window on the side of the house, hands cupped around the face to see inside better. The person was trying the window, jiggling it gently to test if it was locked. My dad was paranoid about that stuff. But watching someone actually try to break into your house while you're inside is a completely different level of terror than anything I'd ever experienced. My legs felt weak, like they might just give out. I let the curtain fall back and basically crawled to my desk, grabbed my phone with shaking fingers, and dialed 911. 911, what's your emergency? The dispatcher's voice was calm, professional, and hearing another human voice almost made me cry with relief. "There are people trying to break into my house," I whispered, crouching down behind my desk like that would somehow protect me. "I'm home alone, and they keep knocking, and now they're checking the windows." The dispatcher asked for my address and I gave it, my voice barely above a whisper. "Are they armed? Can you see weapons?" she asked. I hadn't even thought to check for weapons. The idea made my throat close up. "I don't know. They're wearing masks, Halloween masks. There's 3 of them, maybe more." She told me to stay on the line, that officers were being dispatched and were about 8 minutes away. 8 minutes. That felt like an eternity. She kept talking to me, asking questions. Was I in a room with a lock? Did I know these people? Had they said anything threatening? I answered automatically, my brain only half processing what I was saying. The knocking had stopped. That somehow felt worse than when they were pounding on the door. At least then I knew where they were. Now the house was completely silent except for my ragged breathing and the tinny sound of the dispatcher's voice. Then I heard it, a scraping sound, metal on metal, coming from the back of the house, the kitchen door. We had this old sliding glass door that led to our deck, and the lock on it had always been kind of loose. "They're trying to get in through the back," I hissed into the phone, scrambling to my feet. The dispatcher's voice got more urgent. "Is there a room you can lock yourself in? Preferably with only one entry point?" My parents' bedroom had a lock on the door, and it was upstairs, away from both entry points. I ran for the stairs, taking them two at a time, my heart hammering so hard I thought it might actually burst. Behind me, I heard glass breaking, not shattering, but that distinct crack of glass giving way, followed by the screech of the sliding door being forced open on its track. They were inside. They were actually inside my house. I got to my parents' room, slammed the door shut, and turned the lock. It was one of those flimsy privacy locks, not a deadbolt, the kind a decent kick could probably break through. I pushed their heavy dresser in front of the door, adrenaline making me strong enough to move it by myself, even though it usually took both my parents. The dispatcher was still talking, telling me the police were 6 minutes out, telling me to stay quiet, to stay hidden. I could hear voices downstairs now, casual conversation like they were guests at a party, male voices discussing something I couldn't make out. What happened next still makes me sick to think about. I heard footsteps moving through our house, not rushing, not searching frantically, but methodical. Drawers opening and closing in my dad's office. The sound of our TV being unplugged, I recognized that specific pop the speakers made. They were robbing us. Just casually looting our home while I hid upstairs like a scared kid. I heard one of them laugh at something, this normal, everyday laugh that made the whole thing feel surreal. How could someone break into a house, knowing someone was home, and just laugh about it? Then the footsteps started coming up the stairs, slow, deliberate steps on our creaky staircase. I pressed myself against the far wall of my parents' room, clutching my phone so tight my knuckles ached. The dispatcher was whispering now, as if they could somehow hear her through my phone. "Police are 3 minutes away. Stay absolutely quiet. Don't engage with them." One of them tried the handle of the guest bathroom. Then my bedroom door. I heard it swing open, heard someone walking around in there. My gaming setup that I'd spent months saving for. My laptop. My collection of vintage band posters that Veronica had gotten me for my birthday. They were trashing my space, going through my stuff. Finally, footsteps stopped right outside my parents' door. The handle jiggled, once, twice. Then a man's voice, calm and almost friendly. "Hey kid, we know you called the cops. They're not gonna get here in time. Just stay in there and keep quiet and nobody gets hurt. We're just here for the valuables." I couldn't even respond. My throat had completely closed up. I just stood there, pressed against the wall, praying that dresser would hold if they decided to force the door. But they didn't. After a few seconds of silence, I heard them move away, back down the stairs. More sounds of things being moved, collected. A crash that sounded like our china cabinet in the dining room. Mom's grandmother's dishes that she only brought out for Thanksgiving. I wanted to scream at them, tell them to leave that alone, but I bit down on my own hand to stay silent. The dispatcher kept whispering encouragement, telling me I was doing great. That help was almost there. Then, like someone had flipped a switch, I heard rapid movement downstairs. Footsteps running toward the back of the house, car doors slamming outside, an engine starting. They were leaving. Through my parents' window, I saw a dark van, one of those old cargo vans with no windows in the back, peeling out of our driveway so fast the tires squealed. Maybe 30 seconds later, I heard the most beautiful sound of my life. Sirens. Multiple sirens getting closer. Red and blue lights flashed through the window, painting the walls of the bedroom in alternating colors. The police found me still barricaded in my parents' room, still on the phone with dispatch, shaking so badly I could barely push the dresser away from the door to let them in. There were 4 officers, and they cleared the whole house before they'd let me come out. The place was destroyed. They'd taken our TV, my dad's expensive camera equipment, Mom's jewelry box from their bedroom, my gaming laptop, even the spare car keys we kept in the kitchen drawer. The sliding glass door was completely shattered, glass everywhere across the kitchen floor. But what really got me was the front door. It was standing wide open, swinging slightly in the night breeze. They'd unlocked it from the inside and left it open, like they were making a point. Like they wanted me to know how easy it had been. One of the officers, this older guy with gray in his beard named Officer Paulson, sat with me on the couch while they processed the scene. He explained that there'd been a string of burglaries in surrounding neighborhoods over the past 2 months, all on Halloween night. Groups of 2 to 4 adults, dressed like trick-or-treaters or fundraisers, would knock on doors to see if anyone was home. If someone answered, they'd make an excuse and leave. If no one answered, or if they could tell it was just a kid home alone, they'd force entry. They'd hit 6 houses that night alone before getting to ours. I was the first person who'd actually called the cops while they were still inside. My parents got home around 11, while the police were still there taking statements and dusting for fingerprints. Mom completely broke down when she saw the house, and Dad just kept hugging me saying, "You did everything right, you did everything right," over and over. The weird thing is, they caught the group 2 weeks later. Turned out they were operating out of a rental property in Mechanicsburg, about 20 minutes away. 4 people total, 3 men and 1 woman, all in their 30s and 40s, all with prior records. They'd been doing this for years, apparently, moving from state to state and hitting suburbs during holidays when people were distracted and homes were empty. The cops recovered some of our stuff from a storage unit they'd rented, though my laptop was already sold. The thing that still messes with me isn't even the robbery itself, it's how normal they sounded. That casual laugh, the friendly voice at the door, the guy calmly telling me to stay quiet. They'd done this so many times it was just routine for them, like they were working a regular job. Sometimes I still hear that knock pattern in my head. 3 quick, 2 slow, and my whole body tenses up. We moved to a different house 6 months later. Mom and Dad said it was because they wanted to downsize, but I know the real reason. None of us could feel safe there anymore. I still can't stay home alone at night, even now. Veronica thinks I should talk to someone about it, and she's probably right. But honestly, posting this here helps. Just getting it out there, you know. If you're ever home alone and something feels wrong, trust that feeling. Don't worry about being rude or paranoid. Just lock the doors, call the cops, and don't open that door for anyone. People always talk about Halloween like it's harmless. Costumes, candy, and too much sugar before bedtime. That night started exactly like that for me and my best friend Lucas. We were both 13, still trying to pretend we weren't too old to go door to door. Our neighborhood in Cedar Hills was calm, all trimmed lawns and pumpkin lights. My mom had given us one rule before we left. Only wrapped candy, okay? Of course, we nodded and ignored it the second we were out of sight. We'd been walking for maybe an hour when we noticed a porch that looked different. No plastic skeletons, no lights. Just a single orange candle flickering on a wooden table by the door. An old woman stepped out as we got close. She had snow-white hair tied in a bun and wore a knitted shawl with tiny black cats embroidered along the edges. "Evening, boys," she said with this soft, tired voice. "You're my first trick-or-treaters tonight." She smiled and handed us small foil-wrapped brownies, still warm. "Homemade," she added proudly. Lucas grinned and said thank you before I could even think twice. We didn't open them right away. The foil was a little greasy, and they smelled like cinnamon and cocoa. It felt almost too personal, like something your grandma would give you, not a stranger. Lucas said his aunt used to bake brownies like that, and he tore his open, took a bite, and laughed. "See? Perfectly fine." I remember hesitating, the warmth seeping through the foil into my palm. I told myself it would be rude not to at least try. So I ate half of mine while we kept walking toward the next house. About 2 hours later, I started feeling heavy, like every step was through mud. Lucas joked that maybe we'd just eaten too much candy, but his words slurred a little. I remember standing in front of a house with inflatable ghosts when the world tilted sideways. The lights stretched, the sounds of kids laughing faded, and I couldn't tell if I was still standing or on the ground. I heard Lucas mumbling something, but it sounded far away, like underwater. After that, everything went black. When I came to, I was lying on my bedroom floor. My mom was hovering over me, panicked, holding the phone to her ear. My mouth was dry and I could barely keep my eyes open. She said she'd found me collapsed near the front door when she got back from her shift. I tried to ask about Lucas, but my voice barely came out. She didn't even realize I'd gone out trick-or-treating alone. She thought he was home by then. That's when I saw the crumpled piece of foil on the floor beside me, and it hit me like a puzzle snapping together. The next morning, my mom told me Lucas had been taken to the hospital. His parents found him unconscious too in his driveway. The doctors said we were lucky. Whatever we'd eaten had been dosed with a strong sedative. Police came to ask questions, and I remember sitting on the couch trying to recall every detail about that woman's house. The candle, the shawl with the cats, the way she'd said, "You're my first trick-or-treaters tonight." I told them everything I could think of, but the more I talked, the more it felt like the edges of that memory were smudged. 2 officers drove around the block with my mom and me that afternoon. Every house looked normal. Plastic pumpkins, fake cobwebs, all the usual stuff. But when we got to the spot where I swore the old lady's house had been, there was nothing. Just an empty lot with overgrown weeds and a "for sale" sign half buried in dirt. The officer asked if I was sure, and I pointed to where the candle had been, the porch steps, everything. He just looked at me like he didn't want to say what he was thinking. That night, I couldn't sleep. My head throbbed, and I kept replaying the moment she handed us the brownies. I could still smell them, warm chocolate and cinnamon. I could even hear the faint clink of her bracelets as she moved. Around midnight, I heard footsteps outside my window. Slow, deliberate, crunching through leaves. I told myself it was a raccoon, but the steps stopped right beneath my window, and a shadow passed across the curtain. Tall but hunched. I waited, holding my breath, until it moved away toward the street. The following morning, police cars were parked down the street again. They'd found something behind the empty lot, a cellar entrance hidden beneath rotted boards. Inside, there were shelves stacked with baking ingredients, dozens of foil-wrapped brownies, and children's costumes. One of the detectives told my mom quietly that there were also blankets, a lantern, and a small radio tuned to static. No one lived there, not anymore. The house had burned down years earlier after a gas leak. That lot had been empty ever since. When they showed me photos from the cellar, one detail hit me hard. On one of the shelves was a folded shawl with embroidered black cats, exactly like the one the woman wore. The detective said they were still testing fingerprints, but his expression told me they didn't expect to find anything living down there. Lucas and I were told we'd probably ingested just enough to knock us out, not enough to kill us. Whoever or whatever that woman was, she'd planned for a much longer night. A week later, the neighborhood was back to normal. Decorations came down, kids were back in school, and adults talked about it like some urban legend that had gotten out of hand. But I couldn't walk past that lot without feeling a chill. The candle table was gone, but the grass where it once stood never grew back. It stayed like a dark patch in the dirt, perfectly round, as if scorched. Every time I saw it, I swore I could smell that same mix of chocolate and cinnamon lingering in the air. It's been years now, and Halloween still makes me uneasy. I don't touch anything homemade, not even from people I trust. Sometimes, when the porch lights start flickering at night, I remember her voice, soft, almost motherly, telling us we were her first trick-or-treaters. My mom says trauma can play tricks on memory, that maybe I misremembered parts of that night. But I know what I saw. I know what I tasted. And I know that somewhere out there, someone else might still be handing out those same warm, foil-wrapped brownies.